It is impossible to imagine the horror of a person who found himself in an unfamiliar place when he opened his eyes. It turned out to be a trial, and three grown men were terribly unhappy with the heroine in front of them. The judges shouted that they had decided to sentence Mint Litanides to life imprisonment. The girl did not immediately realize that she was the young woman accused of murder. The heroine had just woken up in this body, so she didn't have time to understand where exactly she had ended up. Meanwhile, like a real prisoner, she was already being taken through dark places to prison. People around didn't believe that this young girl could really kill so many people at once. The heroine could never have imagined that she would become the youngest serial killer, and only she knew that the blood on her hands was actually a lie, and no one would die from it. It's all because the girl read a novel with exactly the same bloody plot in her past life. That's why young Mint even believed that she was being punished for reading this hot novel. And now, for the rest of her days, she really did have to serve her sentence in an extremely cruel and dangerous place. Litanides tried to behave quietly and peacefully, so as not to attract unnecessary attention prematurely. She was brought to the prison of Niflheim, which was famous for the fact that no one had ever managed to escape from it. The escape was further complicated by the fact that this place was an island with only one road to land. They showed no mercy to Mint, so they roughly threw her into the center of the cold cell. The guards didn't care if this little killer died soon in this place, but the heroine could not tolerate the injustice that led to her character being cruelly punished. But right now, according to the plot, the lady had no way out. Her own powerlessness irritated the girl, who in her past life had always been responsible for herself. And now she had to silently wait for the main character, who would be able to organize an escape from prison. Mint could only hope that knowing the entire novel would help her survive here. But for some reason, Litanides ended up in prison too early, which shouldn't have happened. This meant that her meeting with Helios Caprio could only happen after a long time. The likelihood that the girl would not survive with such a fragile body was extremely high, but the guards remained insensitive to the child who was imprisoned for murder. The fear of death made the heroine's heart beat faster because she did not want to die so quickly. So Mint had to go through many trials before she reached the top. No matter how much all the guards were against her, the heroine was not going to give up. Litanides was determined to survive, despite all the difficulties that came her way. 10 years later, one of the prisoners named Kamen was brought to the same prison. She was immediately made to understand that nothing would come easy in this harsh and cruel place. The guard told the girl in an extremely impolite manner about how Niflheim prison was organized. Kyra was curious about why there was a tall tower in the center, but no one gave her any answers. At that moment, she noticed a girl with long blue hair sweeping the yard in the vacant lot. This prisoner seemed incredibly beautiful to Kamen, despite her silent appearance. Yes, it was our heroine who kept her promise and managed to survive in a cruel prison. The guard did not allow Kyra to admire Mint, because he addressed her as if she were of lower rank. He said that in the high tower, one could increase one's rank by participating in competitions. This made the new girl realize once again what a terrible place she had accidentally ended up in. Litanides noticed the red-haired girl and was even the first to speak to her out of interest. Kamen didn't expect that such a beautiful prisoner would call out to her so easily, but it turned out that Mint needed to sweep exactly in the place where Kyra was now standing. Before the girls had time to chat, two ignorant prisoners interrupted their conversation. The heroine's expression changed dramatically, as she hated those who interfered with her work. These guys had just arrived at the prison and were happy to see that there were girls among them. None of the guards were going to interfere in the small squabble between the prisoners, so the boys were able to move freely and even grabbed Mint by her long hair. Everything about the girl warned them to keep these fools away from her. Onlookers slowly began to gather from the sidelines, wanting to observe the conflict. Only Kyra was worried that no one intervened in the prisoners' quarrel. But after a moment, Kamen realized that the blue-haired lady didn't need anyone's help. With the help of magic, she easily transformed her broom into a real and powerful weapon. The new guys didn't think they would face such a serious problem on their first day. The heroine smiled slyly at them and declared that it was time for her to defend herself in response. At such moments, the girl never hesitated to use force, because it was necessary to show who was in charge. But for Kyra, what she saw right before her eyes was incredible. Never before in her life had Kamen encountered such strong magical energy in a person. In just a few moments, Mint used magic to transform the broom so that it would attack the two boys. The boys were clearly at a loss, as they did not know how to resist such an enemy. In a few seconds, using a broom, the heroine easily and effortlessly dealt with her opponents. At the same time, Litnides pretended that she was not controlling this suddenly angry instrument. Eventually, one of the guys decided that since he couldn't get close directly, he needed to do it secretly. He forgot about his sense of honor and dignity, because the desire for revenge turned out to be many times stronger. However, Mint would never be affected by such a stupid attack, so she easily countered it. Litnides threw the prisoner back with a powerful movement, not regretting that she had harmed him. But the girl couldn't relax for long after that, because the prison director came running in haste to the noise. So the heroine had to account for her actions, which she herself called self-defense. By the way, during her time in prison, Mint not only managed to survive, but also became a leader. This is all because she had magic of incredible form and power, which helped the girl rise to the top. With this energy, which is used by more than half of humanity, nothing was impossible. Magic covered almost all areas of life, starting from the compaction of one's physical form, and ending with the insidious ability to influence the minds of others, subordinating them to one's will. So, when powerful magic awakened within our heroine, nothing stopped her from becoming a leader. But even such an important person had to listen to the director tell him how bad he was. Ralph Garman liked Mint, but he couldn't turn a blind eye to the disturbances in public order. Moreover, Litnides kept joking about various topics, instead of having a serious conversation. All this only angered the old man even more, who was already on edge due to the recent noisy events in the tower. The heroine did not at all hide the madness that she was forced to acquire within the walls of this place. After all, she arrived here at such a young age that there could be no talk of any normal psyche. The situation was made worse by the fact that the girl had to eliminate many people with her own hands during the tests. So, in the last years of her life, the heroine barely retained her humanity, remembering the past in another world. No one knew that in reality, Mint Litnides had long been on the verge of true madness. Therefore, the girl did not want to waste time beating around the bush in conversation with the director. The old man sighed heavily, although the prisoner had guessed correctly, and he had important business with her. As soon as the heroine heard that he was offering her to get out of prison, her face changed dramatically. The director promised that he could record that Mint Litnides died during the tower's testing. It was an incredibly illusory opportunity, but the lady could not refuse it so easily. The girl did not expect that she would soon have to keep an eye on a new prisoner who would end up in jail. But Ralph needed this man not only to survive, but also to become the leader of this prison. Even with all the heroine's strength, it was difficult for her to guarantee something like this in this unstable place. But Mint liked the deal, because otherwise she wouldn't have been able to get out of there anyway. The girl insisted that they seal their agreement with magic, as this would be an ironclad guarantee. Ralph had nothing to hide, so he shook the hand of the always suspicious prisoner with a light heart. Now a new era was beginning for Litnides, which she entered with a cheerful smile on her sly face. However, even the heroine could not imagine that she would have to play the role of a guy for the sake of her difficult mission. A few days before, on the director's orders, she collected all her things from the cell where she had lived for a long time. But Mint was not sad to leave, because the possibility of freedom flashed before her eyes in the future. But his close subordinates were not so happy about the news that their leader was suddenly leaving. So Ramona and Daryl began to fight among themselves for Mint's attention, which Mint thought was stupid. The pink-haired girl had a love for teasing, so she showed off all her skills. So the heroine felt sorry for Hera, who had just recently found herself at the moment of her dismissal from her post. This is because even under Mint's rather soft rule, not all newcomers lasted even a week. Litnides advised Kamen to find people to do all the work for her as soon as possible. Only after this did the girl say goodbye to her subordinates, hoping that everything would be fine with them without her. The heroine was forced to tell everyone that she was being sent to execution, because it was impossible to talk about the mission. She had to undertake this work in complete secrecy, so the girl had no intention of giving up her secrets. But the lady herself was not thrilled that she had to play the role of a guy named Garrett instead of herself. The heroine thought that when they were talking about a person, they meant another girl, and not a man at all. So Mint was quite surprised when she heard that she would be going to the men's cells on the west side. The old man saw no problem with Litnides having to hide his true identity, although the crazy heroine hinted to the director that she did not have male paraphernalia. This innocent joke angered Ralph, since he had suggested that the girl disguise herself from the very beginning. The old man managed to think through a plan down to the last detail, in which the strongest prisoner was to participate. That's why he gave Mint an artifact in the form of a bracelet that completely transformed her into a guy. True, Litnid still felt strange seeing himself in such a new form, reflected in the mirror. But she couldn't help but agree that this artifact was a very good thing. Now her appearance was radically different from before, and seemed very mediocre. But what pleased the heroine most was that she had to try on the role of a security guard. The girl was even given a special uniform, which only improved her chaotic mood. Thanks to her new status, Mint won't have to sit in a cell in the same position as that person. So the newly minted Garrett was fully prepared for his mission, which he was not afraid of. Litnides tried her best and read several thick books about how to be a guard at Niflheim prison. The only thing that worried her was that a new leader was soon to appear in the tower, and the heroine had to help the unknown newcomer rise to the very top, displacing the head. The girl tried to behave discreetly so that a casual acquaintance would not be able to recognize her character. Garrett shouldn't have let on that he knew anyone in this damn place. It turned out that not everything worked out for the guards, because for some reason, Sir Stephen did not show up for duty. But this did not matter at all to the heroine, who continued to play her role with restraint. She still shuddered at the thought of arriving in this place about 10 years ago. All this time, Mint obediently waited for the hero of this story to appear in prison. But the description of his actions was so superficial in the plot that the lady knew little. Therefore, she had to get out on her own, protecting the person assigned to her. The journey to this guy didn't take too long, although the corridors of Niflheim remained confusing. The girl was eager to meet her charge, for whom she would be responsible. He was quite handsome and young, even despite his face being slightly beaten by the guards. But it wasn't even this that surprised Mint, causing her to stare silently at the guy who was completely unfamiliar to her. The prisoner looked back defiantly, not intending to show his depressed state. The whole point was that this man was the hero of the novel that Litnides found herself in. It was the son of a duke named Helios Caprio, who had undeservedly ended up in this dark place. According to history, this guy was the successful son of a duke famous throughout the empire. But his own father accused him of crimes and locked him up in the harshest prison. As a result, Helios became the first person to escape from it in the future. On his way home, he met a beautiful girl who healed all his wounds from his father. This is how Caprio easily overthrew the duke and took his place, marrying his beloved. And the heroine had to choose which plotline she would follow to get out. But Mint couldn't rely on other people, so she chose the path of the director. Litnides intended to place the crown on Helios's head and then run away with him. And first, the girl had to tame this evil and ferocious beast, who was dissatisfied with everything. The lady reread the communication guide, so she started by complimenting the guy's appearance. None of the real guys understood why Garrett suddenly started talking about such things. Helios became so angry in an instant that he started yelling at his guard. Only the sir next to the lady hinted to her what exactly was going on. Otherwise, she really didn't understand. No one in male company usually communicated in this way, so Garrett's words confused everyone. The heroine only now realized her mistake, because she spoke so calmly on her own behalf. But Mint had no intention of correcting herself, and continued to push her line about the prisoner's beauty. Her response was an even more dissatisfied howl from Caprio, who was not delighted with the compliments. The whole situation was saved by the unexpected appearance of Commander Stephen, who was a little late. This guy immediately noticed that Garrett was using the tactic of mocking the prisoners, although in reality, Mint had nothing of the sort in her plans, because she was just trying to make friends. It was in the girl's interests to confirm that she envied Helios, just so as not to appear strange any longer. The prisoner himself was ready to do anything just to change such a terrible mentor in prison, and Garrett enthusiastically stated that all her statements were due to her inferiority complex. It took Stephen a moment to realize that the new guard was simply playing along with his previous joke. But Helios once again begged for his caretaker to be urgently replaced. The heroine in this situation was saved only by pretending that she wanted to get promoted. Just in case, she continued to smile stupidly, supporting any words her boss said. Stephen was pleased with the work of Garrett, who was assigned to the new prisoner. He immediately warned that this man was dangerous because he had wiped out an entire village with his own hands, and only Mint knew that Caprio was not actually dangerous. But before becoming friends with this serious man, she had a lot to go through. Mint herself was not thrilled with the cell in which Helios was forced to live for some time. That's why she immediately told him about the opportunity to rise higher by participating in the tower tests. All this time, Litnades, in the body of a man, was going to support the son of a famous duke. But Caprio himself was hostile towards the security guard, who had already given him suspicious compliments. Garrett promised that he would definitely protect the prisoner so that nothing happened to him. And to begin with, the heroine unfastened the handcuffs on the guy's wrists, since they were not needed. The girl had no doubt that she could lift this man to the very top. But Helios didn't believe that such a fragile guard was able to do anything for him. Instead of answering, Mint sharply struck Caprio with magic, but he dodged at the last moment. Litnades was only pleased with his good reaction, but that was not her entire demonstration. The duke's son stood there, hesitant, while the guard demanded the blow. In the end, the prisoner gathered his strength, but did not add any magic to his actions. Because of this, the heroine stopped the guy's powerful fist with just her fingertips. The girl didn't even have to try hard to defeat this tall and strong man. With one movement, Mint easily dropped the big guy, who didn't even realize what had happened. Helios was surprised that he was defeated so quickly by some nondescript guard. Garrett calmly reminded the prisoner that magic had to be put into all attacks. At this point, the guard advised the man under his charge to hit him in the eyes, as they offer little protection. Before, Caprio never thought that the person assigned to him would actually teach him everything. In response, Mint said with a smile that she only gives such lessons to the most handsome men in the world. The heroine never ceased to enjoy Helios's embarrassed reaction at such moments. That's why Miss allowed herself to make fun of the hero, although she planned to teach him well. Then Litnades remembered that the test tower was supposed to open tomorrow, so Helios had a choice to make whether to participate in the competition now or in a week. It was in Mint's best interests for the guy to go tomorrow, but she couldn't force him. However, Caprio did not disappoint the heroine, because he boldly agreed to go to the tests in the tower. This man gave Litnades hope that she could really get out of prison with him. The next morning, even before the tests in the tower, the heroine was in for a bit of a surprise. All because Helios turned out to be much more hot-tempered than she initially thought of him. Mint had no plans to keep her charge in perfect order, so she did not interfere. So the guy himself desperately got into fights with any prisoner who said something against him. However, Litnades still had to intervene to calm the enraged Caprio. Upon seeing Garrett, Helios was outraged that he had not protected him from the attacks of other prisoners. Only the guard said that his charge did not die, so everything was fine. In fact, such clashes among guys were the norm, so no one was surprised. But there were situations that could have caused serious harm, so Mint waved her hand. She created a magic shield in time, feeling the approach of someone's insidious blow. Litnades did her job well and did not interfere unnecessarily. For the first time in his life, Caprio saw magic used for defense rather than attack. True, since the heroine was forced to hide her strength, she ended up with a bad shield. But this alone was enough to make the other prisoners look at them with jealousy. Caprio was not at all touched by this unexpected kindness, because it brought even more problems. But Litnades stubbornly did not notice this, believing that she was doing everything right for protection. Even Stephen couldn't convince the girl, although the guards weren't supposed to stand up for the prisoners. In fact, he didn't come to lecture the new guy, but to tell him about the tower. Within a minute, everyone who wanted to was sent to the first test of the prison structure. Helios acted cautiously, correctly expecting a blow from any side after defending. But Mint was absent-mindedly thinking about what the tower actually was, which she couldn't understand. She walked the whole way, reaching the very top, although this was not an easy task. Each test was more of a survival challenge for any prisoner in the jail, and the theme from the 1st to the 20th floor was insects, which were not at all ordinary. It took Litnades a moment to realize that Helios was asking her questions, wanting to repeat the trick with the shield. The boy carefully watched the manifestations of magic, although he could not yet repeat them. Caprio didn't think about surviving because he was too careless about the trials. So Garrett reminded him that the guy's task would be to complete the mission at any cost. The same thing applied to the other prisoners, who did not know what awaited them in this place. Mint was worried about how the hero would cope with the task set before him for the first time. So she decided to give the guy a little advice that could save his life. Helios listened attentively to his mentor, although he did not understand the meaning of all these words. Suddenly, he grabbed the guard by the arm, demanding a reward if he survived. Mint didn't lose her composure at this point and promised to teach Caprio how to create a shield. Meanwhile, the testing at the testing ground in the tower was ready to begin for everyone. Lytnides felt awkward watching the tests from the sidelines after she had completed them, but Miss could not show that she knew more than was typical of an ordinary security guard. Then, one of the top commanders named Kane Dunst, who had served in the prison for a long time, approached her. But this man was far from being as kind as he tried to appear to the newcomer. Mint listened to him calmly and called the commander without addressing him with respect. This was just what Dunst was waiting for, as he was going to teach the young security guard a lesson for this. But as soon as the old man hit Garrett in the leg, everything didn't go according to his plan. Lytnides accidentally, out of habit, protected herself with magic, so it hurt Kane. The commander, taken aback, even forgot that it was only a security guard standing in front of him. That's how quickly the heroine got rid of the attention of the elder, who tried to trap her. Immediately after this, she returned to her observation post, because Helios was undergoing a test. He was fine, because this man was the hero of the original story. It's true that even such a strong guy managed to get tired due to the endless flow of rats. These creatures rushed at the prisoners with incredible speed, inflicting wounds on them with bites. Initially, Caprio was not afraid of the flow of mice, as he had seen many of them in his life. It was to his advantage that in this test, they were allowed to choose any weapon they liked. But there were so many rats that not all the prisoners were able to cope with them. As if infected with rabies, they rolled in waves onto the poor people who passed the tower. Helios managed to repel all the mice's attacks, thanks in part to advice from his mentor. There were only 5 people left next to him, each of whom was barely breathing from fatigue. They had long ago discovered the pattern by which mice attacked at regular intervals, but even Caprio lacked the short rest that the mice reluctantly granted them. The guy understood perfectly well that at this rate, he wouldn't last very long in the arena. While Mint continued to silently watch him from the upper window, Helios chose the spear as his weapon only because the guard advised him to take care of his legs. Somehow Garrett knew about the test that awaited his subordinate in this round. So Helios looked boldly at the guard and asked for one more piece of advice on how to get through. With a smile, the heroine again reminded her subordinate that he should address her politely. None of the people around could understand why the fair-haired guy was looking somewhere up. Despite all her mischief, Mint still gave Helios a couple more hints. And at that very moment, the rats began their attack again, so Caprio didn't have time to think. He instantly prepared for battle, although the guard's words kept running through his head. The Duke's son strained all his attention to notice what Garrett whispered to him, and the rats continued to rush quickly towards the people, wanting to devour them with their huge numbers. They had no leader, but these creatures did not need a clear plan of action. Suddenly, Helios noticed something round near the edge of the tower, which is what Lytnides had told him about. Despite the prisoner's objections, the boy boldly rushed to that place alone. He took a good swing before striking the spot that had somehow bothered him. At the same time, Caprio tried to add at least a little magic to his sharp weapon. As a result, the spear hit the target exactly, even though the Duke's son knew nothing. The rats jumped back with loud squeals from the prisoner, who attacked them with magic. Even Helios himself didn't expect that he would actually be able to use such a difficult skill. But as a result, his spear glowed, confirming that it was now filled with magic. This time, Caprio felt much more confident in the fight, because he had the advantage. But even so, the guy understood that at this rate, he wouldn't be able to last long in this crazy arena. His spear, imbued with magic, was gradually wearing out, and there was no way to stop this breakdown. And the rats kept running out of the tower window, not at all intending to stop along the way. Only Helios had the courage to run towards them, as everyone was protecting themselves. The mice greeted the boy's approach with protesting squeaks, not wanting to give up their territory so easily. Imagine Caprio's surprise when, At the very end of the arena, he saw a small bridge for rats. All this time, it seemed to him that crowds of animals were running straight out of the wall, and there was no way to stop them. But now it was clear that if these bridges were broken, the rats would no longer disturb the howling prisoners. Only now did the Duke's son understand what all those strange tips from his guard meant. With one powerful movement, he destroyed the bridges so that the rats could no longer reach anyone. Immediately after this, the arena notified the prisoners that their test had been successfully completed. This turned out to be very timely, because the remaining people could barely fight the rats. Helios was the only one who guessed the nature of the test, but no one thanked him for it. Only Mint, in the guise of a guard, cheerfully applauded her charge for surviving the tower's crazy game. The girl was not at all embarrassed by how strange her support looked from the outside. In fact, to pass the level, it was enough to charge the weapon with at least a drop of your magic. But Lytnides had read that it was important to praise her players, so she encouraged Caprio in her own style. She didn't pay attention to the fact that the guy was not delighted with such a display of praise towards him. It was only when another guard hinted to Garrett that it was time to stop that the heroine stopped clapping. Now the new guy had to personally send all the prisoners to their individual cells. Mint didn't even notice that Kane was now planning to take revenge on her a little later for his humiliation. Dunst had never been beaten before, so he wasn't about to let it go that easily. The girl only briefly felt a gaze full of hatred staring at her, but now she needed to remind the impudent Helios that she should be called only by her first name. She lightly kicked her charge, but this blow was enough, since the lady invested magic. So Caprio was bent over, suffering from severe pain in his slightly injured leg. The guy didn't expect that, immediately after this, Garrett would suddenly start stroking his head. The whole point was that Mint decided that now was the right time for praise. At the same time, she couldn't help but notice that Helios's hair was incredibly soft for a guy. Ultimately, Caprio could not tolerate such humiliation and pushed the persistent security guard away from himself. Lytnides noticed that he was so weak now that he did not cause her any harm. But the Duke's son was eager to learn the magic that Garrett had promised to tell him about. The heroine did not refuse her ward training, since this was also in her plans. She said with a smile that she would count on the smart prisoner in the future. And no one except the director knew who the new security guard Garrett really was. The very next morning, the heroine began to teach Helios all the magical skills. The guy stubbornly refused to address the security guard with respect, despite good communication. He reminded that he just wanted to learn how to create a shield to protect himself. What irritated Caprio most was that Garrett was still talking to him about theoretical foundations. It seemed to him that it would be much easier to immediately show how to perform certain tricks. But the more experienced Mint had her own opinion on this matter, so she tormented the prisoner. She reminded them that magic was present in the air of their world on a constant basis. During this time, Helios had clearly managed to remember that there were 5 types of magic. These included physical form, elements of nature, materials, and reason. The 5th type, which Garrett called mixed, raised the most questions for Caprio. But Lytnides didn't want to talk about this type in more detail yet, since she belonged to him. She stubbornly did not notice that, due to the omission, Helios began to behave cautiously. The girl's task was only to teach, and not to understand the boy's vivid emotions. Mint was thrilled that she could teach the prisoner through pain and suffering. But the Duke's son did not understand why life had rewarded him with such a strict teacher. The heroine advised Helios to concentrate properly on the energy within him. It was all because she was going to personally demonstrate all 5 types of magic to the world. Caprio panicked, not expecting the training to begin so quickly. But Mint had already launched an offensive, planning to use only one hand to fight. She filled her fist with the first type, intending to find out in practice which one was closer to Caprio. The blow sent smoke flying in all directions as the girl used too much force. But the lady was able to clearly explain what the use of physical magic means. It seemed Helios could barely bear such power, although Mint tried her best to restrain herself. But Lytnides noticed that at the last moment, the guy managed to block her blow. However, this had a strong impact on the Duke's son, whose abilities were not very high. He understood perfectly well that if he hadn't put up a block, he would have flown back at full speed. But there was not a drop of sympathy towards his subordinate visible on Garrett's face. She didn't give him time to rest, as the next type of magical energy was waiting for Caprio. The heroine openly enjoyed what was happening, since she loved teaching in this way. She concentrated the energy in her hand and was able to reproduce real fire. With the help of this magic, it was possible to create any element that exists on Earth. After which, Mint immediately attacked Helios, who was unable to dodge the blow. Garrett then told Helios about the material type that could create objects. In an instant, she pulled a weapon out of thin air and boldly pointed it towards Caprio. Exhausted by such training, the Duke's son fell to the ground without strength and was unable to rise. With a smile, Mint announced that they would end the training for today due to its complexity. Barely breathing, Helios still remembered that there were still 2 whole unexplored types of magic. But the girl was sure that at this stage, the guy would not be able to block the mentalist. Only at the very end of the training did Lytnides admit that she was that mixed type. She only lied about being able to use each type in very small quantities. In fact, the heroine was able to freely switch between magical energies. But it was too early for the tired Helios to know such details about his teacher. In the guise of Garrett, Mint again comforted Caprio, stroking his head at the end of the workout. Caprio did not dare this time to reject the consolation of the guard, who was embarrassing him with his behavior. It was all because Garrett had a sweet smile when he tried to help the prisoner he was assigned to. The Duke's son kept wondering who his guard really was. But at that moment, Lytnides changed the topic to what kind of magic was easiest for the guy to block. Caprio thought seriously about this question, analyzing all the blows he received today. He guessed that he felt the least pain when the weapon struck his body. When Garrett reported that this was Helios's magical type, he was surprised. It now became clear that the Duke's son had the ability to perform material magic, but the guy himself wasn't happy about the blows he had to go through to understand this. The worst thing for Caprio was that he partly agreed with his mentor's logic. Mint was so unaccustomed to communicating with normal people that she couldn't understand the guy's feelings. Then suddenly, he laughed and admitted that Garrett was the craziest thing he had ever seen in his life. In response, Lytnides could think of nothing better to do than once again praise Caprio for his efforts. She was pleased that the boy was making progress, despite the small amount of training. But Helios couldn't find an answer to the question of why Garrett was helping him in the tower at all. However, the warmth he received from the guard became closer and dearer to him. So gradually, the guy stopped grumbling so much at the strange guy in uniform. As for what was happening on the upper floors, Ramona was frankly bored without Lytnides. She dealt with difficult prisoners with ease because she was well trained. This is one of the reasons why the girl could not find something to do while waiting for the leader to return. All the smart prisoners looked at this lady with horror, perfectly understanding their difference in strength. To Ramona's credit, she didn't bother people who didn't attack her first. All her thoughts were occupied with memories of Mint, who was supposedly subjected to the death penalty. But in fact, everything was fine with the heroine, and she was training young Helios. The guy was once again not thrilled with the crazy ideas of the guard, who was now telling him to jump into the pit. With a smile on her face, Lytnides declared that she would not wait long and would push her charge down herself. But the sharp peaks in the open pit didn't give anyone a feeling of safety. In 2 months of training, Caprio was able to make significant progress in using his abilities. Meanwhile, Sir Stephen was worried that Garrett was receiving more and more tasks related to Helios. The heroine herself understood perfectly well why the director acted this way, but she could not explain anything. She felt like her social life was in perfect order, because everything worked out so easily. The girl herself didn't notice that Kane was unhappy with the tea being too hot for him. He became even more angry when she burned the documents instead of putting them in the archive. Lytnides managed to cause problems for the security guards as well, as she did not allow anyone into the warehouse while on duty. The heroine herself did not understand that with all her actions, she was only worsening her situation in society. So she calmly trained Helios so that he could stand up for himself in the arena. The Duke's son was rightly indignant at the methods his personal guard presented to him. However, Mint was sure that only in an extreme situation would his powers fully manifest. The Duke's son couldn't argue that it was better than falling during the test in the tower. The heroine advised the guy to think about what could have saved him during this fall, after which, without further ado, she pushed Helios to the edge, even though he was completely unprepared for it. So when the guy started to fall, he let out a loud and piercing cry for help. In response, Lytnides, as usual, just smiled, since she had everything under control from the very beginning. Literally, a moment later, the girl happily noticed that her theory with the extreme situation had worked. During his fall, Caprio unknowingly created a huge web that protected him from all the spades. At the same time, he himself could barely breathe normally from fear, because he could very well have just died. But the heroine didn't see any problem with this, because in the end, the guy didn't feel any pain at all. The Duke's son still refused to believe that the guard's theory had worked successfully, but for Garrett, it had long been clear that there was not a drop of common sense in this prison world. The prisoner still had a lot to learn from his mentor before he could get back on his feet. Suddenly, during their conversation, the heroine noticed a piercing and hostile gaze on herself. She turned in his direction, but as expected, she didn't see anyone suspicious nearby. Only the bars in the wall, behind which nothing could be seen, caused those very unpleasant feelings of being watched. Mint did nothing, deciding to rely on luck and the flow of life. And already the next morning, mysterious observers with grins on their faces made their presence known. Helios didn't expect the other prisoners to become so interested in his humble person. It was immediately clear that these guys had managed to climb many more floors than Caprio, who had recently been jailed. Mint found this suspicious and looked around, noticing Dunst's figure. As the girl thought, the old man did not act on his own behalf, but hired the strongest prisoners. Meanwhile, the guys were already pestering Caprio, although he tried not to talk to any of them. From the outside, it seemed as if the stranger was actually smiling sweetly at one of the younger prisoners. But the Duke's son felt uneasy just from his glance, since it did not bode well. Moreover, Helios suddenly felt that he could not move a single centimeter of his body. It seemed as if this unknown guy was deliberately influencing the young prisoner in some way. But at that very moment, Garrett gently grabbed Caprio's hand and carelessly started talking about dinner. Helios was surprised to find that the strange force immediately ceased to affect him, as if it had never existed. The grinning guy had to watch silently as the guard led away his chosen victim. He had never met this green-eyed guy before, so he didn't realize how strong he was. The heroine tried her best to get Caprio to the dining room as quickly as possible, but she was just a little late. The impudent prisoner could not come to terms with the fact that such a tasty morsel had been taken from him. In Garrett's body, Mint haughtily reminded him that no one was allowed to attack the guards. But the stranger didn't care anymore, because he wanted revenge for the recent humiliation. It was clear from the girl's eyes how she felt about such a stupid decision. Within a moment, the prisoner felt that he could no longer move from the spot. Too late, the insolent man realized that the guard in front of him had also used telekinesis magic, and it was so strong that the guy could only move his eyes in this situation. Litanides also taught a lesson to Helios, who was standing aside and was very confused by what was happening. The Duke's son did not understand where his teacher got so much strength from when he spoke of the opposite. The impudent guy had already realized that he would soon receive a well-deserved blow from the strong guard. But Mint wasn't going to feel sorry for him, because this prison had completely different rules. She only used a fraction of her force during the blow, but even that was more than enough for the poor prisoner. The poor guy ended up falling to the floor and hitting his head quite hard on the cold floor. Litanides loomed over him mercilessly, refusing to let him move even for a moment. She wanted to harm this fool, but then someone boldly threw a knife at her right from the crowd. Caprio noticed this too late, so he was unable to do anything to help the security guard who stood up for him. Mint was lucky, and the knife only slightly grazed her cheek before it fell with a loud clang onto the stone floor. Naturally, all the prisoners began to deny their involvement in this matter, due to Garrett's strength. The girl carefully wiped the blood from her face so as not to stain her uniform, which could get her into trouble. The Duke's son tried to intervene in the teacher's battle, but the crazy heroine could no longer be stopped. She snapped her fingers and caused a magical flash of light to appear along with the summoning of her weapon. Helios had to watch from the sidelines in amazement as Garrett skillfully attacked the prisoners. It was the same broom that Litanides had once used to clean and keep an eye on everyone. The girl had honed her magical skills so well that she didn't even need to hold the weapon in her hands. The assistants of the already beaten guy trembled in horror, but were unable to defend themselves from an ordinary broom. As a result, in just a few seconds, this simple cleaning item dealt with all of the girl's enemies. The prisoners were so badly beaten that they didn't even think of getting up after this short fight. Mint even managed to tell Helios what kind of weapon she used on the insolent prisoners. The lady had access to the final form of material magic, when objects themselves protected the owner. At that moment, Caprio was glad that Garrett could only use a small part of his magic. He had no idea that in fact, in the body of the guard, there was a girl whose powers were hidden. Garrett himself smiled cheerfully, because he easily dealt with all his opponents with the help of a broom. But Helios was worried about the teacher's cheek, which was wounded due to his fault, because the boys needed him. The heroine admitted that she did not feel pain, so Caprio did not have to worry about her. Only the Duke's son stated that he could not help but worry about the condition of his teacher. Mint could barely contain her surprise that the guy addressed her so respectfully for the first time. In fact, she could easily avoid getting cut, so she decided to do so next time. That night, by the light of the fireplace, Litanides was unable to sleep because the director urgently called her to his office. The old man could barely contain his rage, but he still pounded his fists on the table because of the disguised girl's behavior. He was shocked that Mint allowed herself to beat up even the impudent but high-ranking prisoners. The girl did not feel guilty because she tried to do everything as it was written in the rulebook. But this only made the old man shout louder, since Litanides lacked human tact. However, the former prisoner did not feel a drop of guilt because she did not even know what this feeling was. So Ralph had to sigh heavily and remind himself once again who he was dealing with. This girl always followed orders perfectly, but the problem was that she understood them in her own way. In fact, Mint couldn't even explain to herself why she defended the Duke's good son time and time again. Since he was the hero of this story, even without her help, he would have definitely passed all these tests. But the heroine remembered what a terrible place this prison was, where hell on earth reigned. And this guy of aristocratic blood was clearly not strong enough for the tower at the moment. Because of his handsome face, Litanides did not want Helios to break down mentally during the trials. It wasn't hard for the girl to guess that the director hadn't called her just for the sake of swearing. And she was right, because Ralph came up with an update to the rules for Mint starting tomorrow. The director was confident that this lady would do everything to finally get out of this cruel prison. So for him, Litanides was the best and most powerful chess piece of all possible. But even Stephen didn't expect the order that was given regarding Garrett the next morning. No matter how sorry the guard was for his new acquaintance, he had no right to oppose his superiors. Meanwhile, Caprio was no longer sleeping, as his cellmates could beat him at any moment. So the guy was even glad when one of the guards came for him for some reason. The Duke's son did not expect to be taken to a completely separate room for further housing. The place looked as gloomy as all the rooms in the prison, and for some reason, it was intended for two. Caprio didn't immediately realize that they didn't close the door behind him because they were expecting another person. He turned around in confusion, fearing the newcomer who might be moved in with him permanently. Caprio could never have imagined that he would eventually meet a good old friend. Garrett, who had been demoted to carry out the mission, now stood calmly before him in the form of a prisoner. The Duke's son was so shocked that he couldn't even say a word to his teacher. But the heroine behaved extremely calmly, since she had already been in prison. Unlike her, Helios couldn't come to terms with what was happening in his life right now. That was the end of the guard's instructions, so they slammed the doors shut. Garrett reacted to all the changes surprisingly sluggishly, although he was directly connected with them. Mint didn't care how she carried out her task, as long as she got the result. The guilt was so strong in Caprio that he could not contain his emotions. In response, Litanides calmly reminded Helios not to try to seek justice in prison. The Duke's son was unhappy to hear about the lack of morals and laws in this place. However, Mint did not see anything offensive in this situation, perceiving it as an accident. Moreover, the girl was even glad to be her subordinate's cellmate at that moment. This will make it much easier for her to control and protect Helios at any time of the day or night. Moreover, the problem was that starting tomorrow, they would be sent straight to the 20th level of the tower. After all, if Caprio had gone to the tests alone, he could very well have been seriously injured. But now Litanides will be able to legally keep the guy company in that creepy place. So Mint had a great opportunity to quietly support Helios in battle. No matter how hard the lady tried to cheer herself up, the guy himself decided that he was to blame for everything that happened. His mood dropped to the floor, so he did not want to talk to the former security guard. The Duke's son felt as if he alone was worried about the future of Garrett, who had been sent to him. Only at this moment did the heroine notice that there was clearly something wrong with the guy's face. She pulled him towards her sharply, without explaining anything to the owner of such a beautiful appearance. Only after a few minutes, Helios angrily asked to finally leave him alone. The heroine's eyes darkened with rage at the sight of her charge's terrible state. His entire body was covered in bruises, from constant beatings from envious former cellmates. As soon as rumors spread that Caprio had a security guard on his side, people got angry, and Litnids noticed this nuance too late, since she was busy earlier. Helios was very embarrassed when the former guard so brazenly began to examine his body. But he did not want to admit the fact that he was beaten because of his friend's support. Mint begged the boy with all her might to tell her the names of his worst offenders. But Helios stubbornly lied that everything was fine with him, and he simply fell on his own. What bothered Caprio most was that Garrett even noticed his pitiful condition. In response, the heroine demanded that the impudent guy call her only respectfully and master. The Duke's son was forced to obey because he had to pass the tests. Seeing the slightly blushing guy, Litnides thought that he could be cute too. A little later, Mint allowed her subordinate to blame her for increasing the difficulty of the levels. But Helios had no such plans, as Garrett's punishment was his fault. He wasn't so stupid as not to understand what kind of person the guard was standing up for then. Litnides openly enjoyed the boy's bright reactions, which greatly amused her. Yo! She was even somewhat pleased to return to the familiar atmosphere of the prison bunks. So, although Caprio tried to be indignant, for Mint the conversation was long over. Taking advantage of her position, the girl called the guy to her, and he obeyed her. As soon as Helios approached, Litnides asked him to simply turn off the light in the room. In the guise of Garrett, the heroine made a very sweet face in the hope that the guy would listen. As a result, the angry Caprio's protesting cry was heard throughout the entire lower part of the prison. A few hours later, Litnides was already sleeping peacefully, as she knew how to fall asleep quickly. But the Duke's son was so worried about his friend that he still couldn't close his eyes. If he were in Garrett's place, he would have felt acute resentment at such an incredible injustice. But there was no point in changing anything, so the guy simply turned to the wall. That night, he had a terrible nightmare about his own father, who had betrayed him so easily. With a sly smile on his face, the old man whispered that his son was a real killer. He jumped up in bed early in the morning, in a cold sweat, unable to fall asleep again after that. Helios still felt a wave of rage every time he even briefly thought about his father. The guy felt complete despair due to the hopelessness of his situation at the moment. That's why Caprio planned to get out of prison to take revenge on the treacherous Duke. This emotional pain spread throughout the heir's body, almost consuming his mind. And this same pain made Helios strive to survive in this place, all for the sake of escaping from prison and finally getting to the damned father. A couple of hours after Helios's sudden awakening, it began to gradually get light. The heroine stretched sweetly upon waking up, and only then noticed the condition of her charge. But, as usual, out of spite, Caprio didn't tell about his nightmares. Garrett reminded his ally that they needed to collect their thoughts before the test. True, the girl had not yet had time to really wake up, so she spoke little by little. So she didn't immediately surprise Helios with the fact that they could visit the tower at any time. The Duke's son initially suspected that raising the level would have some consequences. Mint had nothing to fear during the trials, so she acted as relaxed as possible. The girl advised her ward to quickly enlist the support of other people. She was worried that Helios wasn't strong enough to handle it alone. Even Caprio realized that having a mentor alone wasn't enough to call it a team. While the guy sat relaxedly in place, Litnides suddenly activated her ability. She deliberately grabbed Helios's wrist with magic unexpectedly in order to drop him to the floor. Naturally, the Duke's son was not at all pleased with such a bonus from early morning, and Litnides cheerfully declared that from now on their training would take place at any time. She reminded that in the tower, not all attacks remain honest and noticeable. That is why the girl planned to continue actively training her protege. Helios understood that with his skills, he would not survive even with the skilled Garrett. A former security guard compared the fish to sardines, which only remained alive in a school. The heroine required Caprio to gradually learn to be independent in prison. Until then, she planned to actively help the guy get back on his feet with confidence. On the 20th floor, there was a sharp change in location and enemies. which began to differ. All the newcomers were surprised at the sight of the tall wheat that covered them up to their waists. Due to the sudden change of scenery, Helios could not relax before the test. But Mint managed to maintain her calm, which she used to support her charge. Many participants noticed that there were many more people on the floor this time. But Caprio didn't understand why people sacrificed themselves so much, if they died, if they lost. Suddenly, some of the prisoners began to flicker, and then completely disappeared from this place to another. Garrett quickly explained that everyone on this floor was sorted by training level. The heroine quickly looked around at everyone present to assess their magical abilities, after which she happily invited the student to try to survive the game on his own. Helios did not share his mentor's joy, because he mistakenly believed that he was fighting to the death. Due to the difficulty of the floor, the small rats were replaced by huge and stern dogs. Of course, they were much more difficult to deal with, but Caprio still wasn't going to give up. But the guy next to him was less lucky, as he lost his footing and fell down. The dogs immediately pounced on the poor fellow, as if they were just waiting for such a mistake from him. His name was Ged Satane, and he had previously managed to avoid making mistakes during trials. And this time, the Duke's son bravely stood up for the stranger, while he still had strength. Helios reminded the redhead that there would be a break soon, so they could rest. Taking advantage of the fact that Caprio spoke to him first, Ged decided to ask him a question. All this time, the guy was confused by the fact that Garrett was the only one of them who didn't even try to fight. The heroine initially planned for herself the role of a person who would support her from the outside. She professionally searched for rats that had strayed from the arena so that they wouldn't distract anyone. And during the battle, Mint had already accumulated a sufficient number of small animal corpses. What most confused the people around him was that Garrett, for some reason, buried them in thick wheat. Suddenly, a girl we already knew joined the newly formed company, but Helios saw Hera for the first time, so he didn't even linger his gaze on her for a second. What worried him much more was that even during the break, the number of dogs did not decrease. The heroine smiled slyly, as she knew very well the true nature of this level. The girl carefully gave her charge a sign so that he could prepare for the real battle. But the guy didn't immediately understand what exactly his smart mentor was trying to tell him. Within a moment, people were screaming in panic that something was approaching them in the thick wheat. Caprio was unnerved by the fact that he had no idea what to expect from this strange level. Suddenly, on the surface of the wheat, he noticed a tall shadow that appeared right behind him. The Duke's son barely managed to turn around in time to attack the unknown enemy first. In the end, he pierced the straw body with a spear charged with magic. The fact that it was a scarecrow and not a dog that attacked him greatly surprised Helios, who was used to something else. But the enemies didn't give the guy even a second to rest, as another one suddenly appeared behind him. He had already prepared himself for the blow, because he himself would not have time to repel another quick attack. But suddenly, the scarecrow flew off to the side at great speed under the influence of powerful magic. It was Mint who managed to save her charge in time so that he would not be seriously injured in the battle. This is how easily and quickly the heroine defeated the main enemies of this dangerous level. All the scarecrows lay peacefully on the ground after being overthrown, as if they had not planned to attack. Helios felt uneasy just looking at these fast and swift enemies. But Garrett was openly happy that they had managed to successfully complete the test. Only now did the Duke's son realize who the real boss of the 20th level was. The former security guard recalled his words that in this place everyone needs cover. And in fact, the dogs were just a distraction from the main boss of the level. Caprio never thought he would find himself in such a crazy place in his life. However, the test was over at this point, and everyone had to return to their cells. Garrett didn't forget to praise his protege, who had fought well all this time. Only after this did Helios admit that if it weren't for the master, he might have lost this time. Mint was genuinely delighted that the Duke's son had finally thought of her. She consoled Caprio by saying that the higher your level, the more scarecrows attack you. The girl did not expect that Helios would be attacked by 2 straw men at once. The remaining newcomers dealt with 1 monster each, although they received minor injuries. Before leaving the arena, Helios's intuition told him to check the place where the master was. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw the incredible number of fallen scarecrows there. Garrett himself acted as if he hadn't fought anyone at all during the recent test. A little later, Caprio couldn't stand it any longer, and approached the former security guard to clarify something. The morning attack, which had been swift and unexpected, was still fresh in his memory. Only now did the Duke's son realize that this was how Garrett was preparing him for the battle in the tower. In response, Mint smiled cheerfully. Since she had no intention of revealing her secrets to anyone, she reminded him that it was better to discuss such matters in person, after which she called the guy an affectionate name. Helios's expression changed dramatically when he heard the teacher's sweet address to him. This made Caprio so embarrassed that he started yelling at the indifferent Garrett. In his emotional state, the Duke's son did not immediately notice that one of the prisoners had calmly approached him. But the man's voice seemed familiar to Helios, although he didn't immediately recognize it. It was that same recently rescued Ged Satane, who was filled with strong gratitude. Caprio was surprised to find that the boy had no wounds despite the battle. Mint managed to point out in time that all wounds after the 20th floor heal on their own. Since the red-haired man survived only thanks to the Duke's son, he sincerely wanted to befriend him. And Helios, for the first time, did not resist and shook the hand of the sociable and smiling guy. Only the heroine noticed that Caprio unexpectedly did not become mischievous when meeting a new person. She guessed that the Duke's son had treated only her with some disdain from the very beginning. Suddenly, Garrett realized that the cheerful prisoner had greeted him too. Jed was full of enthusiasm for communication and trust in his new friends who helped him in the battle. But the heroine hadn't planned on communicating, so she silently turned away. It looked so ugly that Helios tried to reproach Garrett for his actions. The boy didn't expect that. Even so, his mentor wouldn't change his cruel decision. Mint stubbornly stated that she personally did not need any unions among the prisoners. The girl told Helios that in this prison, she was only concerned about the condition of the Duke's son. This confession made the guy blush as if tomatoes were definitely in his family tree. Caprio had never had friends or acquaintances who were so devoted to him before. But the guy quickly accepted this state of affairs, which was very beneficial for him. Litanides couldn't hear what her handsome charge was muttering under his breath. Suddenly, the guy asked for forgiveness for misunderstanding the master's good attitude towards him. At the sight of such a beautiful face, the girl's heart skipped a beat in enchantment, which she could not resist. Out of spite, Miss reminded Helios that she was in fact only his personal supervisor. But in fact, if it weren't for her mission, the girl would hardly have looked at Caprio. By chance, the heroine noticed the silhouette of Kara, who had managed to reach such a floor of the tower. This only meant that Ramona and Daryl had prepared the girl well for battle. Lost in thought, Litanides completely forgot about the rules of decency and the fact that she was staring at a person. So the girl did not immediately realize that Helios approached her with surprise. For some reason, the guy decided that his master was staring at the girl because she was his type. But the heroine laughed merrily at this assumption, because it was far from the truth. Neither of the two friends noticed that they had been followed by an unknown person the whole time. This person had absolutely no intention of revealing himself now, simply observing the couple. Meanwhile, Garrett and Helios were constantly bickering with each other on the way to the cell. After a few days, our heroes moved up several difficult floors at once, and each time, Caprio emerged from the tests as if he had just died and been resurrected. The guy himself wondered why he felt so bad from a moral point of view. Mint, without a second thought, called her charge a coward, which immediately offended him. Although there was some truth in this, because Helios couldn't even properly look at insects. Litanides absolutely loved to laugh at the Duke's son, which is what she did every time. During such arguments, the guys, as always, did not notice anyone they knew around them, so Ged had to call them himself to show off the assembled team. He immediately started the conversation with compliments towards Garrett, which was quite suspicious. So the heroine interrupted him with a question about what this whole company wanted from her and Caprio. Litanides hit the nail on the head, because these guys really weren't just trying to get close to her, but they were too afraid of rejection, so they constantly circled around the true goal. However, now the entire company bowed to the master, begging him to teach them powerful magic. Satine didn't expect Garrett to immediately refuse their request without even thinking. The former guard turned up his nose haughtily, explaining that he didn't need any other students. The heroine did not stand on ceremony and directed her aura at the people in order to properly scare them away. Kyra imploringly informed them that no one else wanted to take their brother under their capable care. This confession surprised Mint, who believed that Kamen had been trained by her best assistants. No matter how pitifully the prisoners shook, Litnides did not consider their problems to be her own. Therefore, she calmly drove away the entire company, which eventually noticeably deflated her spirits. The girl did not expect that Helios would immediately call her evil and cruel for this. The guy sincerely didn't understand why Garrett couldn't help someone else besides him. Caprio couldn't just let go of the fact that those guys had nowhere else to go. Litnides wasn't at all surprised when the boy developed a desire to save everyone around him. But she had enough sense not to give in to his enthusiasm in such matters. With a smile on her lips, she said that in this prison, it is not customary to sympathize and help anyone. At that very moment, the Duke's son was distracted by the sounds of a fight coming from the side. It turned out that some prisoners were beating Ged vigorously, which prevented them from achieving what they wanted. Those guys wanted to get to Keira, and if it weren't for Satine, they would have succeeded. Kamen felt terrible at the sight of her friend's suffering, but she could do nothing to help him. She saw Helios and Garrett and screamed loudly to save them in such a situation. But Mint still turned away, because she wasn't interested in other people's problems. No matter how cruel the girl's behavior seemed, she insisted that her actions were correct. But Caprio couldn't accept the fact that you could turn your back on people. In response, Litnides once again reminded that she was only interested in the well-being of the Duke's son. At that moment, both boys again heard a piercing female scream from the direction of the slaughterhouse. One of the prisoners finally reached Keira. Although she continued to desperately resist, Helios instinctively moved towards the girl, but did not fully decide to help her. Then the heroine nudged the guy with the words that she didn't raise him to be such a weakling. The girl didn't want to attract unnecessary attention to herself, but Caprio was a completely different matter. The Duke's son blushed with embarrassment when he finally received the long-awaited support. Immediately after this, he ran towards the villains who were trying to harm his friends. Mint remained to watch from the sidelines, not wanting to get involved personally. She remembered the past, when one woman asked the girl to promise her something, but then Litnides didn't understand why she should help anyone else at all. With a smile on her face, the old woman who was the adopted mother never scolded her naughty daughter. And right now, Helios was fulfilling the words of a woman he had never seen in his life. She would like people in prison to still retain their humanity, although it is difficult, and Caprio was the only one who tried to help others somehow, even though he was weak. The heroine didn't understand why the guy was trying so hard for people who wouldn't even say thank you. Meanwhile, he summoned a magical weapon for a while, which worked out well. This surprised the other prisoners, because they couldn't do this, even though they were of a much higher rank. However, Caprio was not able to hold out for long, so he looked for his opponent's weak spots. The boys didn't stay away for long, as they were completely confident of their victory. But the Duke's son was able to find a gap in the attacker's defense, so he easily knocked him down. It was a surprise to the others that a low-ranking person had defeated a stronger person. True, at this point all of Helios' strength ended, so he prepared for a beating. However, Garrett himself burst into the battle to quickly teach the insolent prisoners a lesson. The former guard did this in order to suppress a possible riot in the prison. Although Mint still held the opinion that she should not have interfered, she did otherwise, all because the girl could not stay away when her student was feeling bad. The next morning, Stephen again had to scold the new guy for getting into a fight, but Litnides didn't feel guilty at all, because she considered her actions to be correct. She confidently stated that she had acted in accordance with all the points in the relationship regulation book. Stephen couldn't argue that Garrett had indeed found a narrow loophole in the law. Of course, the girl did not clarify that the insults were not directed at her at all. Yesterday, she managed to talk to Keira, who told him about the start of the fight. The whole thing was that the prisoners began to insult Garrett, and Ged immediately stood up for them. Mint wasn't surprised that many were whispering that she and Helios had a special relationship. Kamen couldn't stand it when someone insulted other people without reason, even if she didn't know them. But the girl was surprised that Garrett did not need any outside protection at all. At this point, they interrupted the conversation and continued to silently watch as Caprio helped the boys. It came as a surprise to Litnides that Stephen actually took her side on this issue. The guy admitted that he himself wouldn't have tolerated insults, so this time he would hush everything up. In gratitude, the girl bowed reservedly to the guard, something she would not have done before. Almost immediately, she heard worried voices from the side, as she could be punished. Helios managed to gather people around him, and everyone was waiting for the verdict regarding Garrett's intervention. The lady was not delighted that Ged was trying to express his gratitude to her again, so she walked past silently, saying that it was actually Caprio who stood up for them. The heroine was already tired of these people asking her to teach them at least something. Personally, Kara was absolutely sure that Garrett was capable of completing any training. She deliberately released telekinesis magic to see how the guy would block it. But due to her inexperience, the girl missed, which Litanides immediately noticed. She quickly rushed towards Helios, who was the one who suffered the mental impact. But Mint was just a little late, and Caprio himself didn't know how to block such waves. As a result, everything inside the heroine flared up with intense anger that flared up in a minute. Kamen realized she had gone too far, but it was too late to try to fix it. What angered Litanides most was that Kyra had managed to show her several visions, so the girl released several magical impulses towards the prisoners. And now this team is bent over from pain in the head due to telepathic pressure. More than anything in the world, the heroine hated it when something got out of her control, like now. But then the trembling hand of the weakened Helios confidently grabbed the master by his clothes. No matter how bad things were for the guy, he still tried to protect his new friends. Now Caprio also began to beg the teacher to at least teach this whole company something, but the heroine still didn't understand why she had to do this at all. The Duke's son felt responsible for the fact that those people stood up for them. Garrett reminded Helios that he should never have been mistaken about him. At that moment, the guy couldn't really answer because of the magic that was squeezing his throat. Mint still had no intention of changing the fact that she was only in prison for Caprio. And the Duke's son remembered this very well, but still continued to resist. He seriously reported that the master himself had once advised him to choose friends for himself. And Helios found such people who, by chance, gathered together into a good company. In fact, Litanides was looking for exactly these words, so she immediately released her charge. She immediately declared to everyone that the prisoners must obey Helios as the leader. None of the company was against it, as long as they learned magic tricks. While they were introducing themselves, the heroine strained her eyes to better study everyone's abilities. Ged Satane was a fine example of the physical type of magic, and it showed in him. Kyra had a good command of telepathy, although she still couldn't control it from time to time. But Seth Galligan turned out to be interesting to Mint, because there was a power hidden inside him. The last one to introduce himself was Brett Bomer, who had the least ability for magic. But even so, the lady noticed how perfectly all these people were suited to Helios's powers. It felt like they were the best partners for the hero in the novel's plot. The girl was absolutely sure that Caprio himself had no idea what a jackpot he had hit. Kyra was still upset about accidentally using her magic on Helios, and she turned out to be right, because Garrett wasn't going to forgive her so easily next time. But it was enough for Kamen that the guy at least didn't refuse to teach them. She barely dared to ask what the connection was between the former guard and the prisoner, to which Litanides replied seriously that she didn't care, because for her only Helios existed. To clear up the misunderstanding, Caprio tried to make the master look like a slightly stupid person. As a result, they began to quarrel with each other again, which looked like warm communication. The very next morning, brutal training of the entire selected team of prisoners began. Mint happily developed Seth's healing skills, which he hadn't even suspected, and only Ged was worried about his friend, and decided to consult with the leader of their group. From the outside, it seemed to Satane that Garrett was being too pushy with the soft boy. At the very beginning, Galligan didn't even believe that he had the ability to heal. No one except the heroine had ever heard before that magic could be divided into anything else. At that moment, the timid prisoner even became frightened because of his incomprehensible fate. And now, Ged felt sorry for Seth, who, in complete shock, awakened his magical powers. Yes, Garrett's methods worked, but at the same time, they somewhat broke the unstable psyche of people. So the red-haired guy admired Helios even more for enduring all this alone. And Mint was pleased that the new company had a good level of preparation. She deliberately pressured new students to try harder each time. At this rate, the training was progressing much faster than even Litanides herself had planned. But the heroine could not rejoice at these small achievements of her subordinates. This is because the floors in the tower promised to become more and more difficult with each level completed. So even such a close-knit company soon found itself with problems in the arena. Only Garrett acted relaxed in any situation. As this level was easy for him, the reincarnated guy was having a great time during the trials, while training his students. As soon as he said that this was not the end, the doors of the dead end suddenly swung open. The whole company was quite surprised that their opponents were now other prisoners. They had never fought with humans before, so even Helios didn't know what to do. Caprio couldn't afford to pass the level at the cost of the lives of other test participants. Only Mint was not at all confused, as she had been prepared for something like this in advance. Since the enemies had an advantage in skills, Litanides decided to take them on. The Duke's son could not allow the master to take the lives of all these people so cruelly. But the heroine did not explain to the student that everything would ultimately be okay with them after the battle. So the anxiety inside Caprio only grew stronger after the words that Garrett would handle everything. However, the former security guard simply brushed off his annoying charge with morality. The heroine had long been prepared for clashes between people, so she did not consider this terrible. In just a couple of minutes, she dealt with each of the enemies, who were significantly inferior to her in strength. The girl mercilessly threw all the prisoners down to ensure she won the challenge. This left Helios so shocked that he was not ready to talk to the master again. Even after passing the test, the guy remained just as quiet, which was strange for him. But everyone else was delighted with the skills of Garrett, whom they chose as their mentor. Their joy caused dissonance in the soul of Caprio, who was sad about the dead prisoners. Even Ged wasn't at all upset, although he was usually the most sympathetic of the group. So the Duke's son could not understand why everyone around him did not worry about the dead. Suddenly, the guys realized that Caprio was not aware of the rules of this difficult level, so Satine delicately pointed the leader somewhere to the side, asking him to look more closely. In that place, the hero saw the very guy who was supposed to die in the arena. Helios was absolutely sure that it was him that Garrett had thrown down, just to win. But it turned out that all the supposedly dead prisoners were resurrected after this level in the tower. As a result, that evening, Caprio sat in his room, ashamed, unable to sleep due to the realization. He felt awkward because he allowed himself to doubt the actions of the master himself. But Mint had deliberately not told her protégé anything about the fights until this moment. She explained that otherwise Caprio would not be so driven to win at every level. This was another brutal training session from the heroine, who went all the way up the tower to the very top. She knew perfectly well that it was useless to try to escape from a prison with special rules, because this tower does not allow anyone to die until the very end. Wanting to find a winner, the girl was afraid that death could break the hero, so she motivated him to fight. For the first time since these words, the Duke's son became interested in what was up there. In response, the heroine joyfully reported that there was a path of salvation for every prisoner. She believed that Helios would be able to escape from prison once he had completed the entire tower. Mint sincerely wanted Caprio to win, because she herself wanted freedom for herself in the future. At that moment, the magic inside the hero intensified, and he saw what he was not supposed to. Even the heroine herself did not notice that the illusion of the bracelet had fallen from her for a few moments. But the revelation lasted only a few seconds, so Helios did not have time to understand anything. As soon as the lady turned around, she again appeared in the form of Garrett, already well known to Caprio. So the guy decided that he was just imagining things because he was tired from the battles. Litanides did not notice the strange state of her ward and advised him to go to bed. But the Duke's son could not get rid of the strange feeling that had consumed him completely. The hardest part for him was on the next floor because of the huge number of insects. Everyone around was in a panic as the creatures attacked from every direction. But Caprio was able to collect his thoughts and became a leader in this difficult situation in the tower. The heroine once again watched the boys from the sidelines, killing the most powerful monsters. She was pleased with the speed with which her charge's magical skills were growing. And again, before the end of the location, the doors swung open and revealed another group of prisoners. Helios discovered that it was not necessary to kill people, as it was enough to immobilize them. Mint did not interfere with his plan, although doing so was many times more difficult than a regular murder. However, while the team was coping with its tasks, the girl had no intention of interfering. In the end, everyone was exhausted, but glad that another test was over. Only Ged supported Helios's idea, as it allowed them to practice their skills. However, the Duke's son still kept his distance from his friend, not allowing him to be familiar with him. At the end of the test, Mint approached her charge, but he instinctively moved away from her. The guy himself couldn't explain why yesterday's mirage of the girl had such a strong effect on him. Unfortunately for Helios, the heroine had a poor understanding of human emotions, so she attributed everything to fatigue. Noticing the awkwardness between the master and the leader, Brett would start making loud jokes every time. But no one took him seriously, so the guy was constantly left out of work. Unlike Boehmer, Litnades did not consider the awkwardness between her and Helios a quarrel. The girl suggested that the guy might have started to feel jealous of her and the other students in the group. But this was not what made Caprio give Garrett strange looks as he watched him. And only a heart-to-heart talk with the master could resolve all the issues between them. So Helios surprised Garrett by asking if he happened to have a sister. Since the heroine was in the role of a guy, she lied that she really did have relatives. The Duke's son immediately showed interest in this because the girl was constantly on his mind. And Mint happily invented the appearance of her supposed sister, making her almost ugly. However, Caprio did not believe this picture because he decided that he saw Garrett's sister. The guy thought she was very beautiful, but he would never admit it to his master. This is because they were not allowed to communicate with the relatives of other people in prison. A little later in the evening, Helios was still thinking only about the girl he had imagined yesterday. He himself could not understand why all his thoughts were reduced only to the beautiful appearance of the stranger. The guy was so embarrassed he couldn't sleep, as his emotions were running high. No matter how hard Caprio tried, he couldn't stop comparing the teacher to that lady. At this moment, the heroine had just finished taking a shower, so she found the student in this state. The girl had no idea that it was her true identity that became the cause of her worries. And Helios himself only wished that these strange fantasies would finally leave him alone. He took another good look at Garrett and was convinced that he really was a guy. True, due to his absent-mindedness, the hero did not notice the sharp approach of the master's face. The Duke's son jumped up in surprise, but could not come up with any excuse. Only now did Mint notice that her charge had begun to look much worse lately, so she stood resolutely next to his bed to make sure he slept well. In fact, the lady was worried that due to lack of sleep, the guy might not cope with the test. Helios denied until the very end that there was anything wrong with him, as he was used to hiding everything. Then, Garrett suggested knocking Caprio out so he could get a good night's sleep until the morning. However, the Duke's son rejected this idea with a cry, as it was too cruel. As much as the heroine wanted to sleep herself, she was forced to babysit Helios. So the lady used the forbidden technique and climbed into bed with her charge. She admitted that someone close to her often calmed her with the warmth of his body. It was that same prison mother Mint, whom the girl missed quite often. Gentle hugs always helped Litnades, so she resorted to their help now. Before going to bed, Helios muttered sheepishly that he had not been a little child for a long time. But this position had magical properties, so the guy was finally able to fall asleep. The next morning, Stephen called Garrett to his office early to inform him of the tower's renovation. This meant that she had a new owner, since Mint had recently gone into secret retirement. All this time, the girl was eagerly awaiting such news in order to get to know the new leader. Usually, it was the highest-ranking prisoner among all the other people. He had the ability to interfere with any level, so the tower would rebuild itself whenever the leader changed. The only thing that worried the heroine was the difficulty of the tower after the technical work. She understood perfectly well that even she might have difficulties in the trials with the new leader. With a sigh, Stephen confirmed all the fears of the former security guard to whom he had told so many things. But Litnades was never able to find out what kind of girl became the leader after her. So the heroine had no choice but to wait until the tower's script was rewritten again. And the first change after a week was the appearance of bloody flowers on all platforms. Everyone felt uneasy at the sight of even the unusually red-hued wheat everywhere. Litnades was the first to realize that everyone now needed to be extremely careful in the tower. This is also because from this floor onwards, each level will have its own particularly strong boss. While the others fought, Mint carefully observed their surroundings. So only she realized that their test was not over after defeating the enemies. The heroine summoned magic balls into the air to push her charges away. Although the prisoners were against such treatment, Miss did not listen to any of them. A bright flash in the shape of a shield flared up near the boys, causing them to fly back. And only Helios landed softly on the ground, because Lythnides took better care of him. Garrett justified himself by saying that he had no right to harm his beloved and beautiful princess. In fact, the disguised guy was warming up all this time before a heated fight with the boss, and it turned out to be a huge cobra with such a bloodthirsty aura that many could have fainted. But the heroine was not at all afraid of all this power, since she was able to resist it. From the mouth of this terrible snake dripped a special poison that could kill with one touch. It was clear to everyone around that even high-ranking prisoners would die in this battle. So Mint had no idea how Helios would have coped with such a test without her. She was prepared for this skirmish, as she had heard from Stephen that many people were dying on the floors. It was this conversation that suggested to the girl that she should be careful during the test. And now, Lythnides has seen with her own eyes how much the tower's complexity has changed. This is because even she will have to fight this boss thoroughly before winning. This made the heroine impatient to find out what kind of madman up there had brazenly taken her place. Meanwhile, Ramona was still waiting for her beloved leader to return. The girl wasn't even embarrassed to eavesdrop, just to gather more news about Mint. Even high-ranking prisoners were in a deplorable state due to the tower's level. But Ramona didn't care about all of this, because she was only pursuing her own goals. It was this crazy lady who became the leader of the tower in order to have the opportunity to fight Lythnides. She enjoyed raising the difficulty of each floor to see more deaths. Even the girl's close friends could not convince her that all this was too unfair. The girl firmly stood firm that only the strongest could survive in this world. So she had no intention of changing anything in the tower, wanting to continue laughing at people's suffering. This was all because Mint was no longer around to tame her boisterous friend. In this way, Ramona called Lythnides back, as she wanted to fight her as soon as possible. Everyone saw that this lady had completely lost her mind, but no one could resist her with their strength. So the only hope was that Mint would return to the top of the tower as soon as possible. But the girl was in no hurry, because she needed to have time to level up her charge for this. Despite the blocking of Lythnides' power, everyone around her was terrified by her incredible abilities. Even Helios couldn't believe that his master was really that strong. For the first time in a long time, Garrett stopped seeming like an ordinary person with magic. However, Caprio did not dare to ask the master who he really was in this tower. He just continued to watch closely the guy who often helped him out in trials. Suddenly, instead of Garrett, that beautiful stranger appeared before Helios again. But this time, the guy was able to get a much better look at the incredibly beautiful girl. The Duke's son stood there, hesitant, afraid to frighten away this vision. But for a few seconds, the lady did not disappear in front of the guy, silently looking back at him. For some reason, it seemed to Caprio that the silhouettes of the girl and the master suddenly merged into one. Suddenly, Garrett sharply called out to the student, who stood frozen in amazement not far from him. The heroine could not understand why Helios was staring at her so strangely all this time. And the guy himself was angry because he continued to see some strange things near his teacher. This evening, Caprio tried to reclaim his rightful place on a separate bunk. But Mint enjoyed sleeping next to him so much that she did not tolerate any objections. In fact, despite all the awkwardness, Helios himself slept much better this way. However, this time, the thoughts in the guy's head still did not give him peace and peaceful sleep. He looked suspiciously at the peaceful face of the master, who had already seen more than one dream in a row. The thought that this guy constantly seemed like a girl to him made the hero feel uneasy again. The Duke's son did not understand what was wrong with his head, since he saw such things. However, these images never stopped appearing at the strangest moments in time. Because of this, the guy became more and more confused and stopped understanding where reality was and where a dream was. But the heroine slept well every night, so she was only glad for the trials in the tower. During the passage of levels, Ged managed to become close to many prisoners in the prison. But Helios was too thoughtful to follow the example of the sociable guy. The only thing that interested him was the phrase that those guys' cobra spat red poison. He clearly remembered that his snake was oozing some kind of unpleasant black liquid. Suddenly, Garrett, who had also heard this conversation, appeared next to him with a sly smile. The guy asked his friend not to turn him in to the others, since they didn't need to know about the poison. Only now did Caprio realize that they were the only ones facing another difficulty in the tower. It turned out that the color of the poison was also influenced by the level of the test received. Mint said with a grin that she still had this difficult training under control. Taking advantage of the master's sociability, Caprio began to ask him about the use of the sword. However, Litanides managed to turn even such a serious conversation into jokes and ridicule. She had indeed summoned a sword not long ago, although she didn't particularly like the weapon in battle. The girl playfully joked that she found it much more pleasant to secretly beat all her enemies. But then Kyra asked in surprise who Helios had been talking to all this time, away from them. The guy was amazed and said that he had actually spoken to the master, but hadn't seen him nearby. It turned out that the heroine specifically spoke only to the student using magic. Despite all the shame of this situation, Helios did not turn in the joking teacher to the others. So the heroine was once again able to happily joke about the guy, who wasn't offended by her. The girl herself didn't notice that for the first time in a long time, she was opening up in communication with him. That evening in the room, the lady again reflected on the fact that the tower's complexity was abnormal. She didn't like the fact that at this rate they might take too long to climb up. The current level of difficulty reminded her of the past, when she herself first conquered the tower. At that time, the leader was such a cruel tyrant that he did not spare even his close subordinates. The difficulty was only reduced when the heroine's so-called mother took his place. So now the girl needed to contact the director in any way possible as soon as possible. But the lady had no idea how this could be done at all. All rooms for guards and prisoners were strictly divided into different floors. Therefore, the only option was to remove the bracelet, which was not the most desirable outcome. The heroine had very little time to think, because Helios was soon supposed to return. He was still in the shower, but he clearly wasn't going to sit in the cool water forever. She was also worried that she might be tracked down by an extremely unpleasant person from her past. The last thing Mint wanted in the world was to date him, even though she was a little stronger. In the end, the desire to contact Ralph overcame all the precautions in the heroine's head. So she took off the bracelet with pleasure, feeling like she was in her real body again. Litanides was pleased to feel the power that literally pulsated in her blood. But she didn't have the opportunity to enjoy this feeling, because she had to hurry. So Mint quickly materialized a message, which she sent to the director upstairs. The girl had no doubt that her magical impulse would quickly reach its target. Never before had this speedy substance failed Litanides in her aims. The heroine only regretted that she had to constantly hide from her enemy. However, she still concentrated her energy for a brief moment to check the message. At exactly that moment, the shower door opened and a washed Helios appeared in the room. The boy clearly didn't expect that instead of his teacher, he would see that same beautiful stranger again. So he stood at a distance, hesitant, not knowing what to say to this lady. Mint couldn't admit that she had been Caprio's master all this time. She expected the guy to show up, but meeting him still happened too unexpectedly. Despite all her closeness to Helios, the heroine could not confess anything to him. Suddenly, the Duke's son rubbed his face with his hands in confusion, which gave the girl a small clue. After which, Caprio began to anxiously ask where his favorite master was. Mint smiled in response, thinking about how to quickly knock out the good prisoner. Helios himself spoke to the stranger, although she stubbornly remained silent in front of him, all because Litanides was assessing the mesmerizing color of her diligent ward's aura. The girl was lost in thought and did not notice how the Duke's son had managed to get significantly closer to her. The guy still didn't understand whether he was in a dream or seeing this lady in reality. With a grin, Mint asked if Helios really liked such a strange and incomprehensible dream. Caprio even recoiled in surprise, since he could not admit to something like that. The girl did not pay attention to his words about Helios liking his teacher. Instead, she knocked the guy out with a quick and deft movement to send him to sleep. The Duke's son immediately lost consciousness, which was only to the heroine's advantage at that moment. She herself did not expect that she would be able to so easily knock out the hero of the plot, after which, without regret, she threw him onto the bed, giving him the opportunity to have a good rest. Helios seemed extremely difficult for Mint, but she successfully completed the task. At the same time, the lady did not understand why the guy even said that phrase about his attitude towards the teacher. Right now, Helios was sleeping so peacefully, as if this whole strange situation had never happened. So, just in case, the girl erased part of the guy's memory so that he would think it was a dream. No matter how sad the lady was about this, she could not sacrifice her mission for the sake of another. Soon the heroine's little assistant returned to her and brought with him a reply message. Mint immediately put the bracelet back on, so that there would be no more unpleasant situations. Of course, she was much more comfortable in her own body, but she had to endure it for the good of the mission. And immediately, the loud voice of a disgruntled Ralph poured out on her, because Litanides had to open up. The girl quickly covered her ears with her hands, as she had long been accustomed to the emotional director. She was intrigued by Garmon's words about something unusual happening when the leader changed. The girl remembered very well that there were two ways to become the head of the top floor. The first option is to reach the 100th floor while the leader's position is absent, or kill the previous one, take his position, and take control of the entire tower. It so happens that Clark was supposed to become the leader, but he is on the brink of life and death. Mint was surprised that the person the tower had accepted could not influence it in any way. The director could promise that he would soon begin talking with the leader as soon as he woke up. At the very end, Ralph reminded the girl about completing the mission, but she already knew that. As soon as the message disappeared, the heroine began to think hard about everything that was happening around her. She understood that the leader had definitely changed, and the tower recognized him as the next one, although no one liked him. But for some reason, the director never told who actually took her place at the top, and this caused Litanides to sigh heavily, as she would have preferred to have all the information. It turned out that this knowledge was either not needed by her or could interfere with the completion of the mission. The heroine herself did not notice how she fell asleep and opened her eyes when Helios suddenly jumped up. The guy looked like he had just seen a real ghost somewhere in the hallway. He did not pay attention to the master for a long time until he himself called out to him. Meeting Garrett's gaze, Caprio instantly blushed as memories came flooding back. Out of horror and shame, he covered himself with his hands, not wanting to explain anything to the former guard next to him. But Mint couldn't just ignore the fact that there was something wrong with her charge's face. Then, Helios finally told that he was worried about the strange phrase he had said in his dream. He said with displeasure that he had almost confessed his love to the master, which he had not expected from himself. In response, Garrett calmly reminded that it was all just an ordinary and unremarkable dream. In essence, the heroine could not help the student in any way, since she was the cause of all his problems. And the Duke's son continued to look at her absent-mindedly, not understanding what was going on. Suddenly, he was struck by a realization that was fundamentally wrong, but it wouldn't leave his head. For some reason, Helios mistakenly decided that he had fallen in love with a man, although he was attracted to the girl. But the master did not want to help his student with emotions in any way, since he himself had little understanding of them. The heroine herself was in a great hurry to get to breakfast, as all the meat would be gone quickly. But even Caprio noticed that Garrett was constantly watching him, without hiding it. The Duke's son tried to deny, until the very end, that there was anything wrong with him lately. But it was clear that for some reason he was embarrassed every time he saw his mentor. No matter how hard the guy tried to resist the truth, he couldn't even look Garrett in the eyes. So Caprio had to lie and say he was just really thinking about the tower tests. He was truly worried about the abilities that the teacher used so easily against the bosses. To divert suspicion from himself, Helios said that he was thinking about his long journey up. The girl never thought that her ward could worry about something like this all this time. She gently took the student by the chin to support him on this difficult path. Mint promised the guy that she would definitely take care of him, so he didn't have to worry. In fact, the heroine was pleased with how she raised Helios in the time allotted to them. Even on his current floor, Caprio has consistently proven to be one of the best during tests, so the lady partly enjoyed messing around with the newbies, to whom she imparted a little knowledge. The girl liked Helios precisely because it was impossible to find anyone like him in prison. Only Caprio dared to grumble at the master, despite all the difference in their strength. So the heroine felt more alive when she was with this particular person. Mint admitted that she definitely wouldn't let the guy die, so she doesn't understand his worries. Of course, Helios could not admit the true reason for his worries to the master, so the girl could only continue to tease the secretive student. The longer this conversation lasted, the more awkward the Duke's son felt next to the master. But even though the guy was becoming too harsh, Litanides still supported him. It was no longer even for the sake of the mission that the girl was going to take the Duke's son to the very top of the tower. For some reason, this promise made the guy blush, as if Garrett had offered him something intimate. So the girl was at a loss as to what was wrong with her subordinate. She honestly admitted to Helios that she was very poor at understanding people's emotions. This circumstance explained a lot to Caprio about the master's strange behavior in the past. Mint hoped that the kind and obedient student would be able to explain many things to her. In response, Helios sighed heavily and admitted that he admired Garrett's strength and skills. And he is not the only one who feels such strong respect. So people gather around the guard. Such understandable reasoning seemed too childish for a grown man to Mint, so she didn't take anything seriously, so Helios would try even harder. In the end, Caprio stated in all seriousness that he was going to become as strong as the master. Lytnides was only benefiting from the protagonist's desire to reach the very top. However, Helios did not have the same disdain and prejudice as the heroine. Mint didn't care about these little things, because the main thing was that they would all reach the top of the tower together. In fact, all this time, Caprio was trying to convey that he would be attached to the guy no matter what. But Lytnides understood everything completely differently, and now it will be impossible to convince her of her opinion. Meanwhile, it was time for the whole team to conquer the 30th floor of the tower in trials. In order to survive, the boys had to run a lot, since they could not defeat everyone at once. Jed took charge of Seth, who could barely stand on his feet due to the fear he had experienced. But soon they all ran into another dead end, which took away everyone's moral strength. Galligan couldn't stop shaking from the fear that consumed his entire consciousness. Meanwhile, the test of the 30th floor was supposed to begin for everyone only now. Only Mint knew in advance what the essence of this level was, but she didn't tell anyone. Suddenly, a dart flew at Seth from the side of the target and hit him right in the center of his chest. But the guy himself didn't feel any discomfort, although everyone else was very worried. At that moment, no one even thought to look at the target, which began to glow slightly in the darkness. A moment later, a huge mouth opened on her, rejoicing at Seth's fear. This monster happily invited everyone around to play hide-and-seek from a real maniac. At that very moment, they all moved to a completely different place, which left them puzzled. Mint pointed her finger at Seth and demanded to know what exactly he was most afraid of. It turned out that the guy couldn't stand ghosts and horrors with serial killers inside. And it was these very creatures from Galligan's head that the floor summoned so that the prisoners could fight them. At first, the boys didn't even really understand how to fight the summoned monster. Although Helios bravely rushed at him, all weapons passed through the ghost as if right through him. All this time, Seth did not stop shaking with horror, although he remembered that it was possible to survive in one zone. This character was weak in a safe place, which is what the team needed to find. Galligan was sure the character came from a horror book he had recently read. While everyone was busy with Seth, Helios noticed that Garrett was extremely calm, so the guy guessed that this whole place was already familiar to the master, who remained silent. In response, he was met with another joke from Mint, who simply didn't know how to communicate any other way. However, the girl still explained that on this level of fear, the target is always chosen randomly. Many of those who ended up in prison were mentally unstable, which is what the level took advantage of. So the theme of this part of the tower has always remained a fear that has to be dealt with. Lytnides always considered this place the perfect place to go completely crazy. Besides, there was something she didn't like about this killer from the start, but she couldn't find the answer. Caprio saw that Garrett was again trying to slowly separate himself from the rest of the company in order to kill the boss. It was a bit of a light warm-up for Mint, so she got to work happily. At the same time, the girl asked the student to look around carefully so as not to die. Brett was the best at scanning the area, but he was getting pretty tired. However, he fought with all his might to get his comrades out of this difficult situation. But Kair was sick to death of constantly running away and hiding from that terrible maniac. She wanted to fight that nasty darts, even if it would ultimately be useless. But Helios had a different opinion on this matter, because they became characters from the Book of Set. But Galligan was in such a terrible state that he couldn't tell about the plot. However, after just a couple of minutes, he was smiling happily, as Kamen had influenced his mind. The guys weren't particularly happy with the result, but Kara couldn't do anything else. But now, Seth has fully explained that the maniac can be easily killed in the dungeon of this place. He was full of enthusiasm to imprison the damned enemy, never to meet him again. Despite Galligan's desire to act quickly, Helios urged caution around everyone. No one could predict what awaited them on the way to the door leading to the deep basement of the castle. Thanks to Caprio's skillful leadership, the entire team reached the desired location in one piece. But a moment later, the maniac appeared in sight again, as he wanted to kill everyone. Seth managed to point out in time the pedestal that could be used to stop the enemy. It turned out to be a small podium, near which all the necessary candlesticks were already standing. Now the team had to disperse so that at least one of them could reach the candles. The Duke's son confidently motivated everyone to defend themselves against the terrible and powerful maniac. But this man scattered the prisoners around him in a couple of moments, approaching Seth. It was nothing for him to remove people who were not strong enough from his path, time after time. Galligan was well aware of the hopelessness of his situation, so he was frightened again. Kyra's hypnosis had already worn off, so the boy didn't even try to defend himself. But the Duke's son did not allow even one of his friends to die at the hands of this damned monster. He shouted loudly for Seth to run to the candles, while the maniac was still far away. Galligan didn't have to be told twice, for he knew this purification ritual better than anyone. Meanwhile, the enemy did not give Caprio a second to rest, constantly attacking him. The guy barely had time to put up a defense, but he couldn't hit his opponent with anything in return. Meanwhile, his weapon was gradually cracking from the incredible power of just one ghost. Helios remembered how strong his master was, with just one sword in his hands, so he also summoned this sharp weapon that could perfectly strike at close range. Caprio swung with such force as if his life actually depended on the blow, and it worked, as a powerful wave of magic hit the screaming enemy squarely. At that moment, Seth just managed to seal the ghost, which he happily told everyone about. And immediately after that, the entire space of the tower returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. Helios turned to the enemy he was fighting and called out the master's name. In response, Garrett actually appeared from under the bag, replacing the ghost. The heroine had already dealt with the boss, but to level up the team, she played another one. In fact, the girl felt guilty, because boss levels were more suitable for her, so she left the students with enemies who would not have killed them with the first blow. In fact, Helios saw that same beautiful lady again instead of Garrett. She appeared in the master's place more and more often, so Caprio had time to study her aura. That's why the guy confidently stated that he would always be able to recognize Garrett, because he remembered everything about him. This didn't bother Mint, as she was glad that the students had successfully completed the test. The girl didn't expect that the guy would consider her achievement alone for winning at this level. Helios could never admit how special the master was becoming to him. The next day, many prisoners did not want to visit that floor of the tower again. Litanides could understand them, because not everyone was able to cope with their fear. From the side, the heroine heard screams, and noticed how one of the guys was being brutally beaten. The prisoner, under heavy blows, shouted that from now on, he would always agree with everything. The girl guessed that this was how the stronger ones forced the weaker ones to work only for them. This is all because in Niflheim, no one forbade recruiters from calling people to their side. The guards never interfered with the structures that were built between the prisoners themselves. That's why there were always people on the high floors who were trying to assemble strong gangs. Under Mint, it was forbidden to cause damage during recruitment. But now everything was different. The girl was only afraid that Helios could become a desirable target for many groups, and she turned out to be right, because just a moment later, one of the evil prisoners approached them. The guy quickly approached Garrett, wanting to make a joke about his situation, but just a moment later, with a powerful blow, the heroine quickly taught this upstart a lesson. The prisoner did not try to get into a fight even more, although he was burning with the desire for revenge. But he had business with Helios, so he approached the guy standing next to him. With a sly grin, the unpleasant stranger invited Caprio to talk alone. He would be glad if the Duke's famous son joined his group in the tower. He handed the guy a paper with a sly expression on his face, which he had to sign. The enemy's magic enveloped Helios from head to toe, and he couldn't even move. The heroine watched what was happening from the sidelines and was unhappy with such coercion. She understood perfectly well that it was equally bad to reject or accept the agreement. But first, Mint fenced off Helios to help him get out of this spell. Litanides was surprised that this time Caprio didn't need her help at all. The Duke's son never even thought of joining another group, because he wanted to create his own. As soon as the leader refused, Mint didn't even have to do anything. The prisoner recruiter himself quietly stepped aside to avoid trouble. But for the guys, this meant that soon there would be others who wanted the same benefits. Lytnides had indeed planned to stay on the sidelines, while Helios made his own decisions. She was not afraid of anything in prison, because just recently she was the most powerful leader of the tower. For the first time, the girl encountered problems due to her desire to remain neutral in everything. Caprio demanded that the master teach only him and defend his student before others. The Duke's son did not want to move on to someone else and wanted to see Garrett's feelings in return. But the girl was alien to such sympathies, since she was used to not getting attached to anyone. Meanwhile, something strange was happening to Helios, because his cheeks turned red and his breathing became ragged. At such moments, the heroine regretted that she could not read the emotions and feelings of other people. She could only hope that Caprio wouldn't change to the same state as she had. At the same time, Ged was having problems because everyone around him was trying to recruit him. Mint seriously suggested that the company disperse to the other camps among the prisoners. But Satine only wanted to follow one leader, and that was the Duke's son. However, Lytnides demanded that prisoners at least interact with people who shared their interests. Only after this did the red-haired man think about expanding his circle of friends in prison. But Helios had no intention of doing anything like that, ignoring the master's advice. The girl tried her best to convince the student that the offer would be very useful to her, but the guy stuck to his opinion, since he saw only himself as a leader. So he continued to be angry at Garrett, who only wanted the best for the stupid student. The girl even had to cover her ears from his displeased shouts, just to avoid going deaf. But then Seth changed the subject in time, remembering that things would soon become restless in prison. Galligan overheard the return of an unknown figure, known to everyone as the Commandant. The heroine, like no one else, knew how dangerous this man she was sending away was. But during her absence from the throne, the man again entered the prison and took his high place. This Commandant was a real bastard, for some reason obsessed with a blue-haired girl. So now Mint has another problem in the form of this crazy stalker. Therefore, in the near future, the girl will have to behave quietly so as not to show her place. The recruiters were becoming more and more aggressive, but Helios was still dealing with them just fine. Lytnides did not interfere in the fights, since there was no need for it yet, but Caprio got tired of the constant clashes, as he did not hit his opponents in their vulnerable spots. Here, Kara whispered to Garrett that it would be nice to praise the guy for his victory, but the heroine believed that there was nothing surprising or praiseworthy about this. Kamen had no idea that the master could have so many strange problems with communication. But Mint really didn't delve too deeply into people's emotions, since it didn't interest her. However, Kara still quietly asked Garrett to support Helios next time. During this trial of fear, the entire team was transported to a beautiful kingdom, and the heroine appeared in the role of a handsome prince in this fairy tale, which related to Snow White. This time the dart hit her, but the girl simply didn't like fairy tales. All the prisoners were immediately scattered across different locations, and the lady had to find them. She never thought that the tower would distort reality so much, adapting to her fears. But the floor of this level wasn't high enough, so I only took what Mint didn't like. Since childhood, the girl neglected fairy tales, considering them empty and meaningless. So she was glad for this easy level, and happily went to the center of the castle. Already at the entrance, Lytnides discovered Seth, who stood as a guard right at the gate. But until the lady touched the guy, for some reason he himself could not move even a little. Next, Mint had to free Hera, who had sent her a telepathic message. But Kamen turned out to be just a magic mirror, and not the queen herself. The comical nature of the situation even made the heroine laugh at the embarrassed girl. They had to find the entire team before they could get out of this place on the floor. The company soon encountered Brett, who took on the role of a brave hunter, and Ged turned out to be a small dwarf, which suited his explosive and noisy character. Until Mint touched the prisoners, none of them could control their bodies. So Lytnides was worried that Helios was still somehow nowhere to be seen. Then Satine remembered that there was one place that he himself could not get to. The guy was referring to a small river flowing down from a fairy tale mountain somewhere above. However, the gnome's path was blocked by an invisible fence, so he did not explore anything earlier. The heroine asked her friends not to go anywhere without her, and she herself went after Caprio. Jed tried to ask for help with Garrett, but he couldn't get through the invisible barrier. Mint wasn't at all afraid of traveling alone through an unpleasant place. She calmly explored everything around her, gradually feeling her student's aura more and more strongly. Soon the girl climbed to the top of the mountain, where a beautiful coffin stood near a large tree. It was in this place that the Duke's son lay all this time, since he too could not move. The girl was very surprised by the role that fell to the eternally grumpy guy. She couldn't help but laugh at Helios's appearance, which had changed somewhat now. With his face red with shame, Caprio lay in the coffin in a beautiful dress, similar to Snow White's. Barely holding back her laughter, the heroine carefully examined her charge in the coffin from all sides. The girl said that the dress suited Helios, in order to laugh at him even more. The boy blushed even more from the master's jokes and from the fact that he still couldn't move. Mint didn't hesitate any longer and concentrated magic in her hand, touching the guy. But this didn't help much, because now he could only move his arms, and only a little. Lytnides realized that she would have to follow the plot of the story to free the princess. Meanwhile, the Duke's son already wanted to get out of this situation as quickly as possible, but he couldn't even imagine that for this, he would have to endure one kiss from the teacher. The heroine wasn't sure if Kaira could have helped in this situation by kissing Helios. However, the guy stopped Garrett and asked him to be the one to save him from imprisonment, all because Caprio suspected that his master was actually that blue-haired girl. But Mint thought it would be wrong for two guys to kiss each other. In response, the Duke's son recalled that he had no prejudices on this matter. Only this pushed the lady to take decisive action, no matter how strange it might be. In fact, Lytnides had never kissed before, so she felt awkward. However, she had no other choice if she really wanted to help the poor student. As soon as the girl touched Helios with her lips, some kind of warmth slowly spread inside her. She noticed that it didn't affect the guy, as lips alone weren't enough to disappoint. Suddenly, Caprio pulled the teacher towards him, demanding a more sensual kiss. At that moment, the Duke's son again saw Mint's true appearance before him, which he enjoyed. So he easily turned the master over, ending up on top of him in this beautiful coffin. Lytnides still doesn't understand why Helios shows so much feelings for her, even though they are both guys. But from now on, Caprio didn't care what form the blue-haired beauty took in front of him. A few minutes later, the Duke's son finally turned red from the emotions that had washed over him. The heroine did not miss the opportunity to tease the guy in front of her a little again. Suddenly, Helios's clothes changed, and now he too was the prince of this country. Only Mint could not calm down, reminding the student that he was a princess. At that moment, the barrier disappeared, so the others were able to climb the mountain without any problems. Caprio barely managed to crawl out of the coffin so that nothing would remind him of the recent kiss. But Garrett, out of spite, still said that some strange insect had bitten him on the lips. Of all of them, only Kara guessed what ending the boys were trying to bring to life. The heroine felt strange that this world did not disappear, although they had complied with all its conditions. The girl immediately suspected something was wrong, and immediately felt someone else's presence nearby. It turned out to be a female figure in a dark cloak, whose appearance none of the boys noticed. She appeared right in front of Helios and Garrett, who looked at her in fear. An old voice whispered that he needed the lost child, who should be nearby. Kyra immediately guessed that this man played the role of the queen in this strange and incomprehensible fairy tale. The woman pulled the hood off her face and revealed herself to be Mint's former mother. Kamen felt a huge energy coming from her, so she rushed to Helios for help. But all the guys' attention was now focused on the master, who was behaving strangely. When the heroine saw her mother, she froze in place, as she was not ready to face her. Meanwhile, the old woman was slowly approaching Mint, not doing anything bad yet. She extended her hands to her, whispering that she was still looking for her beloved child. Suddenly, the atmosphere around changed dramatically as the queen cast a powerful spell. Lytnides only managed to put up a magic shield at the last moment, blocking the blow. If she hadn't done this, the other prisoners would have suffered greatly from the aura. The heroine couldn't even imagine that the bonus level would contain such a catch. But the queen did not want to give up so easily, still wanting to take her desired child with her. Mint's powers were greatly limited by the bracelet, but she wasn't about to give up so easily. The girl put maximum energy into the blow, hoping to quickly finish off the Mad Queen. But the old woman withstood the force, as she was stronger than Litnids had expected. During the impact, she continued to quickly look around in search of the child. And the old woman saw the desired child, who, according to the plot of this cursed fairy tale, turned out to be Helios. The queen approached her son with incredible speed, to which Caprio did not have time to react. But the heroine had no intention of allowing this crazy woman to disgrace her mother's bright name. While the queen was distracted by the strangulation of the duke's son, Mint prepared to strike. She didn't really like the weapon she had to summon, but it was the most powerful. It took the girl several minutes to fully load the gun. The final shot was so destructive that it killed the terrible queen in one go. Helios stood frozen in shock at the sight of such power from the master, who had saved him again. And the heroine herself barely coped with the rage that arose inside her at the sight of her mother's image. This situation left Caprio with even more questions about his teacher. But now the boy was too tired to try to get answers out of Garrett. The girl remembered that the student was still able to create a spear, even though he was attacked with such force. However, the guy himself believed that his efforts had still been too little to win. For the first time in a long time, Mint seriously considered praising a diligent student. So, on Kyra's advice, she hugged the guy tightly, who was completely lost in his thoughts. As the lady expected, the duke's son did not know how to accept praise, so his whole body tensed up. However, Helios was pleased to receive such support from a man with whom he had many connections. Everyone else was happily discussing their victory over the queen and didn't pay any attention to the boys. And in his head, Caprio again remembered that a beautiful girl had appeared in Garrett's place. At the very end, their silhouettes merged into one, proving once again that they were one person. But Helios still did not dare to personally ask the teacher about this strange situation. Instead, he asked if he could really reach the top of the tower with such powers. Since Mint had complete faith in her student, this made him feel even calmer. Meanwhile, at the top of the tower, the prison commandant's office opened for the first time in a long time. The man's name was Rake Sutcliffe, and he had caused Lithnades a lot of trouble in the past. Right now, he smiled slyly, as he once again felt the magical aura of the beautiful girl. Rake was overjoyed to find that his target was still somewhere in the middle of the prison. He quickly called for an assistant, who had difficulty getting used to his master's new responsibilities. Previously, the guy was an ordinary security guard, but he was urgently promoted to this role. He reported that Brett had been keeping a close eye on the target, and there had been no problems so far. Stackliff gave orders for the prisoner to continue carrying out his plan without revealing himself. He was sad because the moment he got distracted, Mint disappeared as if she had never been there. But the man still felt her presence, wanting to take possession of the girl as quickly as possible. What bothered the commandant most was that no one in the prison knew Litnadia's location. Meanwhile, he needed this strong and beautiful girl again to carry out his plans. That evening, the heroine was once again worried about having to use her power in the arena. She had no doubt that Rake had definitely noticed the waves emanating from her magic. At the moment of the shot, the girl felt the mark of that strange man appear on her again. But in the guy's appearance, this thing disappeared, which pleased the lady, who did not need problems. Once Saddlecliff discovered her, he would definitely be constantly searching throughout the prison. But now Mint had to deal with Helios's strange behavior, which did not obey her. Recently, the guy always avoided looking at her and was absent-minded during training, and it all started right after their hot kiss, for which Litnades partly blamed herself. She approached the guy, who this time again desperately tried to move away from the master. But the heroine was not going to tolerate this attitude any longer, so she demanded that he hit her. As soon as the girl started talking about the kiss, Helios immediately shut her mouth to avoid rumors. This made Litnades completely convinced that Caprio was angry with her because of that situation. But the boy was surprised when Garrett asked him to release all his anger on the teacher. It never occurred to him that the master was interpreting all the awkwardness between them in this way. Mint was right when she noticed that the duke's son was still avoiding her in every possible way. At that moment, the lady stopped pressuring Helios, who was too correct for this prison. All she could do was reduce all contact with the student so that he would stop being embarrassed by her. This time, the heroine arrived at the meeting earlier than necessary in order to leave Caprio alone. Stephen barely made it in time, as he had too much to do lately. The heroine herself noticed that the tower was becoming more and more restless day by day, A strange feeling haunted her even during the trials, not giving her any peace or tranquility. However, the girl was so absorbed in training that she did not immediately notice the problems in prison. Meanwhile, one after another, the prisoners began to disappear somewhere, as if they had never existed. This caused many to panic and cut off all ties with former friends out of fear of dying. Mint specifically marked several prisoners, and soon they too disappeared somewhere. The girl had no doubt that all the missing prisoners had been dead for a long time. It was the change of leadership that led to this horror, but the rate of disappearances was still incredible. However, in her situation, the heroine could not help the poor low-ranking prisoners, so she tried to put out of her head all the problems that no longer concerned her. Even her mother's words no longer troubled the heroine's soul, as she was able to abstract herself. At this point, Mint was only worried because all the tests were adjusted to her level. The girl was glad that in all this madness, Stephen still treated her well. The guy heard about the recruiters and sincerely sympathized with Garrett, but he couldn't help in any way. The heroine was surprised that Stephen was confident that everything would become calmer for a while. The guard explained that many prisoners had been called to clean up because of the corpses on the upper floors. He had a premonition that something terrible would soon begin, about which he warned his subordinate. Meanwhile, at the training ground, Garrett's entire team continued their intensive training in magic. The girl hoped that they hadn't managed to do anything during her short absence, but as soon as she entered the site, she saw a serious fight in the very center. For some reason, Helios found himself in the middle of the action and was fighting several people at once. This situation did not suit the heroine at all, who gave other instructions to the students. All the others did not get involved in the fight, so they watched the leader from the sidelines in fear. Even Ged couldn't amuse Garrett with his favorite jokes at this moment. As Lythnades approached Helios, the very air around her thickened with rage. The girl did not hold back her emotions, as she was angry that Caprio disobeyed her order. As a result, the guy was badly beaten, although he never lost during all the difficult battles. Mint demanded a quick explanation of what kind of brawl had occurred during a routine training session. His friends fully supported Helios's decision to engage in battle with the other prisoners. Kyra said that they were not the first to attack, but they had to fight back. The Duke's son still couldn't control himself when someone seriously offended his acquaintances. The heroine was not at all surprised that this was the reason for the clash between the prisoners. Kamen begged Garrett not to take any punishment against their leader. However, from now on, it was a matter only between Mint and Helios, who disobeyed her. The girl became so angry that she forgot to control the pressure with her aura. But she quickly came to her senses and left Caprio's innocent followers alone. Mint herself couldn't understand why this whole situation made her so angry. Before the heroine's eyes appeared the embarrassed face of Helios, who promised to always obey her. Kyra continued to defend the leader, who simply stood up for Garrett, who was being insulted. Everyone was sorry that the training ended in fights, because Caprio began to defend the teacher's honor. In their smiles, the lady saw blind adoration and a desire for her to no longer be angry. The girl was familiar with these feelings, as this was not the first time she had encountered something similar. Before, she was also surrounded by people who admired and at the same time feared her power. But Mint knew that all their good feelings were driven only by the need to survive. But for some reason, Helios was different from the others, and the heroine couldn't find the reason. Once again, the guy looked away, which only angered the lady even more, even though she didn't mean any harm. She called the guy to follow her so they could talk in the courtyard without any unnecessary witnesses. Mint could immediately see that Helios was acting as if he truly felt guilty. The Duke's beaten son did not say a word, because he did not know how Garrett would react. He was even a little offended because the mentor did not show a drop of anger. Caprio often missed those rare moments when the master sincerely consoled and supported him. Mint looked at Helios in surprise when he began to beg her not to leave him because of the fight. The heroine had never even thought of anything like that, so she couldn't understand what they were talking about. Caprio was so upset by the fear of being left alone that he even looked into the master's eyes. Once again, the heroine regretted that she did not understand human emotions at all. In response to the guy's panic, the girl calmly said that she had no intention of leaving him at all. Helios stared at the master in surprise and realized that he had misunderstood the whole situation. He pulled away from Garrett sheepishly, fully aware that jokes were about to follow. Mint laughed with delight at the Duke's poor son, who was afraid of being abandoned. Caprio covered himself with his hands out of shame and blushed to his ears, since he could do nothing else. Suddenly, Lytnides moved sharply towards her charge and demanded that he remove his hands. The girl was again angered by the fact that the student tried to hide his beatings from her and did not look her in the eyes. Meanwhile, during the fight, Helios was hit in the face quite hard because he did not hit to kill. It was painful for the lady to see such damage on the handsome face of the Duke's son, so she ordered that Caprio should not allow anyone to touch him anymore. The guy himself was not against the idea of his master being the exception from that moment on. Out of spite, Helios declared that the teacher who left him alone was to blame for everything. The Duke's son deliberately tried to provoke emotions because he wanted to get more attention from the master. In response, Mint teased the student again, calling him a poor little boy. Until now, the heroine did not know what plan would be best for her to follow when climbing the tower. She was troubled by Stephen's warning that he was sure that a massacre would soon begin in the tower. Therefore, she allowed the student not to avoid fights from now on, which he was noticeably surprised by. The guy couldn't understand why Garrett had suddenly changed his mind about him. Instead of answering, the girl snapped her fingers, calling upon her magic in full view of Helios. While Caprio stood there in confusion, Mint herself wasted no time. With a sly grin, the girl said that one should always fight properly and not half-heartedly. Lytnides was about to teach the student a lesson so that he would remember by example what to do. Helios didn't expect that the Mad Master would actually attack him at such a moment. The guy tried to reason with Garrett, but immediately realized that it was absolutely useless. It was clear that the girl was already fully prepared for a training fight with the student, so Caprio had no choice but to summon his magical spear in response. Lytnides was serious about this fight, so Helios couldn't back down from the battle. True, his strength was not enough to repel even one attack from Garrett, who was capable of many things. The guy barely managed to dodge the spear that was flying at him right as he was falling. Mint was confident that the student would dodge, so she wasn't worried about him at all. The girl leaned over the Duke's son and reported that the spear did not suit him at all. A guess pierced Caprio's mind, who increasingly understood the master's strange antics. He was angry that the teacher did not tell him this right away, but started a fight just for this reason. The heroine said with a smile that such things should have been remembered in an extreme situation. Helios felt bad because he had such a perverted taste in people that he liked. In fact, Mint's plan was much deeper than it might seem at first glance. The whole point was that in the original, Helios wielded a sword, so he could develop faster with it. But in the first stages of the battle, the girl did not correct the student who was just learning to fight. At that moment, Caprio's fallen spear was once again filled with the boy's magical energy. He threw the weapon from a distance towards the master, who easily dodged the attack. Now Helios was seriously determined to prove to his teacher that he could handle a spear. Mint immediately accepted the challenge, since any fight brought the Duke's son experience in battle. Caprio wanted to reach the master at least once, who was incredibly strong for him. Therefore, the guy quickly ran towards him, wanting to achieve his goal with a blow. However, Lytnides easily dodged all of the student's attacks, which were quite predictable. But this time, the guy went further, as he was able to summon a sword immediately after the summoned spear. The girl didn't count on this, so she found herself in a situation where it was difficult to dodge in the air. Helios had no intention of feeling sorry for the man who was constantly laughing at him at any moment. But these actions of the student only brought a satisfied smile to the face of the calculating heroine. She was able to dodge this attack as well, although it was much more difficult than before. Mint hadn't previously recommended a specific weapon to the boy, because he had a talent for everything. Moreover, even in such a dire situation, the girl came up with an original solution. As soon as she filled the sword with her energy, it immediately fell apart into small pieces. Helios could not do anything in response, since he had already used up all his strength. But Lytnides was satisfied, because the guy came to the right conclusion during their fight. Now he will develop even faster, because he will no longer limit himself to just a spear. Helios was still dissatisfied with the fact that the master explained everything only in practice. But the heroine achieved what she wanted, as she was able to level up her favorite student again. The most important thing he had to avoid was the habit and stereotypes about the use of weapons. So now Mint has once and for all freed the guy from concentrating on just one spear. As a teacher of such a talented person, the heroine put a lot of effort into his development. True, the hero could not yet understand all the difficulties that the master faced for his sake. Caprio found the training to be chaotic and brutal. But Mint was always pleased, so Helios had no choice but to obediently follow all the advice. True, the very next day the heroine had to reconsider her student's assessment. The Duke's son could hardly move even a millimeter when they needed to reach the end. The girl could not understand why his fears were so great. Each time in the tower section, the target randomly chose prisoners based on fear. Everyone on the team has already been subjected to this difficult and unpleasant test. And this time it was Helios's turn, which the guy was not happy about, as he could not control himself. The whole group found themselves in a dark dungeon, which was filled with insects of varying strength. Mint saw that Caprio wasn't the only one struggling with this terrifying ordeal. Even the always cheerful Brett felt awkward and wanted to finish everything as soon as possible. The girl tried to at least lighten the mood a little, but it did little to help the student. Only Kara did not lose her ability to reason clearly in this place, although she was scared. However, to pass the test, Helios still needed to gather his strength. He understood perfectly well what other creatures they would encounter on their way, because these were his fears. But still, the guy was able to show the right way, since he knew everything in this basement well. As scared as Caprio is, it's now his turn to fight the horrors within himself. And the insects didn't stop for a second, constantly frightening the prisoners. So far, the entire group had dealt with the creatures without Litnade's help, although she was on guard. The girl watched Helios most of all, since it was his battle. The guy was paler than usual and was breathing heavily, even though he had hardly had to fight. Mint couldn't leave him in that state, so she called out to the student who had withdrawn into himself. To at least slightly amuse the Duke's son, Litnades used the claws of a slain praying mantis. She skillfully joked at that moment and was able to distract Caprio a little from his heavy thoughts. Everyone else watched in horror as Garrett played games that only he was delighted with. And the girl, for fun, switched to the rest of the group so that no one would be left without consolation. In fact, this minute of rest really did make Helios feel a little better. Even Brett was able to joke again about love between Garrett and the leader, which was not true. But Caprio couldn't deny the fact that most often, the master only made jokes like this at him. No matter how scared Bomer was of the insects, he somehow managed to overcome his horror. But Helios didn't have time to question him, as Ged began to find out the conditions for completing the level. The guy found it strange that such a brave leader was afraid of just some insects. But Caprio could accurately predict that the level boss would be either a spider or a centipede. This is because the guy was afraid of these creatures more than all other insects. His dislike for these creatures was shared by Brett, who also wasn't doing very well at the level. But Garrett didn't give the team a chance to relax as he drove them all forward. At that moment, a huge beetle rushed from the passage behind the prisoners at great speed. Seth was the one who was most afraid of him, since he clearly would not be able to oppose his defense to the creature. Since the team had nowhere left to run, they had to fight this insect. The beetle let out a loud roar, as if to prove that he was far from peacefully disposed towards the prisoners. But Brett managed to immobilize this armored insect with the help of magical powers. Then Ged, who had a good command of physical abilities, joined in and grabbed the beetle. The combined attack of the friends gave Helios the opportunity to deliver the finishing blow. The heroine watched in amazement at how quickly her charges progressed. But even Caprio's multiple calls did not pierce the beetle's thick shell to the very base. The Duke's son did not lose his composure and bravely jumped on the insect, intending to finish everything. As a result, a huge crack ran through the entire body of the insect, after which it died. Despite the victory, the team leader was exhausted, as he had spent a lot of energy on the calls. Everyone else was also pretty tired, since this was not the first insect they had encountered. Mint understood perfectly well that this level was indeed too difficult for the prisoners. However, thanks to her presence, Helios's skills grew with rapid progress. The girl was pleased that the boy had mastered the difficult multiple summoning so easily. He also learned to change the ends of the blades, rebuilding the weapon in mid-air. Litnades could only explain such rapid learning by the natural talent of the Duke's son. She approached the student and sincerely praised him for honing his new skills. This time, Mint had no joke, as she was saying quite serious things. However, Helios himself was still dissatisfied with himself, although he constantly experimented with weapons. The heroine was surprised that the guy only needed one look to repeat some skill. Then the girl remembered that this dark and dirty place must be well known to Caprio. The boy gave an unpleasant shudder when the master asked him to tell him what this place was. Despite the many confusing paths, Helios found his way around the basement perfectly. But Mint didn't expect that this whole place would turn out to be just the basement of the guy's house. She had never heard rumors before that Caprio's estate had such a secret basement. The girl found it strange that the Duke needed such a dull construction for some reason. But Litandes wasn't interested in the details, so she suggested moving on. The heroine did not expect that Helios would suddenly demand that she start asking him questions. The guy didn't understand why the master didn't care why he was so afraid of this place. Caprio was hurt by the fact that the teacher never showed any interest in his past and personal life. The whole point was that Mint didn't ask about things that had nothing to do with training. So the girl honestly admitted that all this information made no sense to her. This answer only made Helios more angry, because he wanted to hear something else. But it was enough for the heroine that she knew about the future that awaited this hero. No matter what Helios experienced in the past, he will overcome all his fears and take his father's place. So the girl considered his behavior childish and did not want to answer him at that moment. In the end, the guy himself changed his mind about discussing personal topics and asked the master to forget about this conversation. Although, in fact, he was deeply hurt by the fact that the teacher was not interested in his personal life at all. The guy wished that the master would be more emotional and curious, at least around him. But the heroine recalled that she showed interest in the guy only as his personal bodyguard. Instead of answering, like a truly capricious child, Helios walked past Garrett, trying to hide his pain. Litandes was incomprehensible to Caprio's outburst, which in 1 second had driven them far apart. The girl would have preferred to remain in a neutral position with the student, but it didn't work out that way. It seemed to the heroine herself that the Duke's son spoke all these sad words to her quite calmly. But, looking at his back, she felt some unpleasant reticence between them. Meanwhile, the rest of the team continued to fight the bugs, of which there were too many. Litandes noticed that everyone was already at their limit, but she didn't want to interfere with the test yet. What worried her most was that the condition of her main ward was rapidly deteriorating. The boy was quite physically developed, but he could hardly breathe normally because of the fear inside. All the prisoners noticed this, but Helios did not admit to anyone that he felt ill. Meanwhile, every cell in the guy's body was begging him to stop struggling and return to the very beginning of the floor. No one could understand why this place had such a strong influence on their leader, who seemed like a brave man. And only the Duke's son knew that more than anything in the world, he feared the door to which they were gradually approaching. But the guy's condition was also caused by another reason, which was added quite recently. He was hurt by the master's indifference, although a guy in the guise of a girl should never have behaved any differently. So now Helios blamed himself for the fantasies he had built for himself, which had been so cruelly destroyed. The former security guard remained an unbearable mystery for Caprio, and this tormented him even more. Even the other prisoners noticed that Garrett only treated Helios in a special way. But even that recent promise of intimacy that Helios extracted from the guy didn't help them communicate better. She sincerely didn't understand what was so special about him that Garrett had noticed him in particular. The guy didn't want to think that all this was just because he became the guard's first prisoner. After all, it was logical to assume that Garrett would have behaved the same way with any other person. Remembering the master's indifferent face, Caprio made the mistaken conclusion that this was indeed the whole point. This realization made the Duke's son sick to his stomach, and he still couldn't concentrate on the test. Soon, no matter how hard the hero tried to delay this moment, they reached that very red door in the basement. The prisoners were frightened by the mere sight of this massive structure, which glowed ominously. But the worst thing was for Helios, who knew very well what kind of boss was waiting for him on the other side of the terrible door. The boy would rather pass out than continue to participate in this terrible ordeal. As soon as he opened the doors, Ged was the first to curse at the sight of the creatures waiting for them inside the space. There was also a huge spider and a giant centipede, who were clearly eager to feast on people. The question that most concerned everyone was which of them was the main boss of this terrible level. Suddenly, the insects parted a little, and the figure of an unknown person became visible behind them. Only Helios immediately realized who was standing there, and his eyes sparkled with incredible hatred inside. The tower floor was designed as the head of the level of Caprio's father, whom he both feared and hated. Mint immediately realized that the man's powers were too powerful, so she spoke out to the prisoners. The girl offered her help, as she could easily deal with all the creatures in this place. But Helios did not want to give up his prey to anyone else, no matter how much horror and panic gripped him. So he ordered his friends to fight the centipede, which was a little simpler than the spider. While the guy was speaking, he was already charging his weapon with magic so that it would be fully ready for battle. All because he left the spider with the master and decided to fight with his father, despite the difference in their strength. The heroine did not quite understand why she had to remain on the sidelines during these battles. But Caprio was confident that the master's strength would be enough to beat his enemy and help others in the battle. The girl saw how much her student was trembling, although he was trying with all his might to appear brave. That's why she didn't refuse to help him, even though she could have been discovered by that psycho due to the manifestation of her abilities. Helios remembered very well his terrible childhood, which he spent almost entirely in the basement. The boy always ran joyfully to meet the Duke, because he lacked his father's attention. He didn't even pay attention to the scary door, which scared him to death every time. But one day the child froze in fear from another thing he saw next to the Duke. It was from that moment that Helios developed a fear of insects, no matter what they were. It's all because his father artificially bred these creatures and set them on his son. But Helios was not prepared for the Duke's madness, so his psyche was shaken. And even after so many years, the guy trembled with fear at the mere mention of the basement. None of the friends could understand the full depth of horror of their leader, into whose nightmare they had fallen. Mint didn't care about her charge's worries, because she was more interested in spiders. The magic in their poison was so concentrated that it was clear that they had been working on it. In fact, if Helios had asked to kill the boss, the heroine would not have helped him. But removing a few insects was no trouble at all for her, so the girl got down to business. She enjoyed using magic because she had missed fighting. The poisonous spider had no chance to dodge this blow. Mint was brilliant in her abilities and repelled all of the insects' attacks. A mad smile flashed across Litnides' face, who always enjoyed such fights. So, after just a couple of minutes, she dealt with the spider and began to observe the others. The prisoners constantly jumped back in fear from the centipede's blows, unable to reach it. But Mint was already glad that these guys managed not to die during the battle with the boss. But the final battle between the hero and his father has not yet begun due to Helios's fear. So the old man was the first to attack his son, and he turned out to be strong, despite the fact that he was a copy. The heroine saw that the boss's entire body was permeated with the same infected magic as that of insects. That is why this man was not as easy to defeat as it might seem from the outside. And it was clearly visible that Caprio was gradually retreating under the onslaught of the Mad Duke. As Mint was simply observing what was happening, Kyra approached her with questions. Kamen didn't understand why the master didn't intervene in his protégé's difficult battle. Helios was constantly hit because his strength was not enough to defeat his father, and the girl was sincerely worried about the condition of the leader, who could die at any moment. But Litnides believed that the hero should have dealt with this obstacle on his own. Only now did Kamen understand their teacher's cunning plan to force the students to grow. The heroine understood perfectly well that Kyra was not a fool and was deliberately clinging to her. After all, even with the help of the girl's powerful telepathy and hypnosis, she would not have survived. In fact, there wasn't a single person on the team who wasn't dependent on the master. But Garrett himself paid surprisingly little attention to this, focusing only on Helios. That's why Kamen was so insistent that the former security guard do his job well. The prisoner wanted Garrett to carry out his mission in prison until the very end. At that moment, a loud squeak from the centipede interrupted their conversation as Kyra turned off the hypnosis. The guys were on their last legs due to the difficulty being greatly increased at the level. But at that moment, Kamen was only concerned about whether she could convey her words to the master. Mint listened to the girl in silence, as this was the first time she had been reprimanded for poor performance of her duties. He also didn't want Helios to die so stupidly just before the 40th floor. Kamen did not hide the fact that she also had personal motives, since she rose with her teacher. However, the girl was not afraid to risk her life at the right moments, and now was one of them. Kyra hoped that Garrett would understand everything she was so desperately trying to convey to him, and the former security guard smiled softly in response, as this time he shared the girl's feelings. In fact, Litandes specifically tested Kamen, and she passed her test. She rarely saw genuine emotion and a desire to help among the prisoners. So in such a terrible prison place, it was enough to just support each other. Besides, Mint had no doubt that Kamen had simply underestimated her leader's strength. And at that very moment, the Duke's son was able to overthrow his mad parent from his throne. The whole point was that initially, the heroine would not have allowed Helios to fight if he had not been ready. So, although the guy was exhausted to the point of horror, he was still able to overcome the greatest fear of his life. Having finished with the hated Duke, Caprio turned wearily to the master for approval. The heroine saw that if she took the boss away from the student, he would never forgive her. As soon as they finished the test, the doors of this level swung open back into the prison. Brett was more exhausted emotionally than physically, as he too was afraid of insects. Following Boehmer, everyone fell to the floor, as no one could stand on their feet due to fatigue. The heroine was surprised that Kyra thanked her for participating in the test. Mint was bothered by the fact that Kamen was attached to the team, while there were no such things as eternal friends. The girl was puzzled by the master's request to take a closer look at the others. The former security guard tried to take care of his charges like a mother, although he was more of a father. With a sigh, Kyra realized that Garrett was emotionless and best left alone. But in fact, the heroine's words contained a subtle and useful meaning for the mentalist. Kamen's power was dangerous and was constantly evolving due to her persistent efforts. The heroine also possessed telepathy, so she believed that Kyra would soon understand everything perfectly well. The redhead herself was worried that soon a hunt would begin for her among all the prisoners. So Mint gave the girl advice on how to continue to stay close to her friends. The heroine then approached Helios, who was still lying exhausted on the cold prison floor. Even Litandes could tell that the guy was in a completely bad mood because of the battle. Caprio really didn't want to listen to any nonsense in the form of advice from his teacher at that moment. But the girl couldn't leave her charge in such a state, so she sat down next to him. The Duke's son did not object in response, since he really needed support now. Litandes didn't expect the guy to suddenly ask if she had ever killed her family. Helios didn't notice the sincerity in the master's eyes, so he smiled again in disappointment. And Mint thought about this question, because in the arena, she was constantly temporarily killing people. So the girl confessed to the sad guy that she had to allow the death of loved ones. This revelation surprised Helios so much that he jumped up on the spot, wanting answers. As soon as Caprio heard about the teacher's adopted mother, he remembered the queen from the fairy tale. But the heroine was not sure how much she really loved this woman. All she could say was that she felt empty inside when her mother passed away. Her death caused not only pain in the heart, but also an incredible desire to take revenge on everyone around her. However, the girl did not know how much her emotions were similar to what Helios was experiencing. The heroine saw from Caprio's face that he felt better from the realization that someone understood him. The girl still found it strange that people always needed support from others. She quickly changed the subject and moved on to praise, as Helios had once again made progress in his training. Helios admitted that he finally used the sword on purpose towards the very end of the fight, because it was this man who taught him the skill of wielding this weapon in childhood. However, the boy still considered only Garrett as his teacher, without considering other options. But even after such a hard-won victory, Caprio was still not completely satisfied. The Duke's son dreamed of reaching his father in person to take revenge for all the humiliations. The heroine enjoyed watching how much the hero strived for his development, so she admitted honestly to Helios that she usually treated everything with indifference. But the student's diligence and persistence awakened some unusual feelings in the girl. This is precisely the confession that Caprio had been yearning to hear from the master all this time. And now, Garrett has finally revealed what it was about Helios that attracted him. The Duke's son blushed to his ears in surprise, as he was not ready to hear the truth. He even allowed himself to yell at the teacher, who was not at fault at the moment. In a fit of emotion, the guy grabbed the girl's hand tightly, as he was afraid of losing her in the future. Caprio had long known who the master was and had feelings for his true identity, so he even threatened to challenge the former security guard to a duel if he tried to distance himself. Due to excessive excitement, Helios could not restrain himself and even asked if the guy loved him. The heroine froze in shock because they were both of the same gender now, so what kind of love could it be? Flushing again, Caprio came up with the excuse that affection also counted. Then, Mint was able to admit that she really didn't want to lose her favorite student. No matter how hard the Duke's son's heart was beating now, he needed to know the truth. That's why he asked such questions, even though he understood that all this was tantamount to a death sentence. And now Helios will forever remember the master's words that he indirectly loves him. From now on, any test was not scary for Caprio, because before his eyes there was only the dawn of love.